England didn't lose its crown in a blaze of battle. There was no last stand, no epic defense, no heroic collapse to echo through history. Instead, something far more unsettling happened. In the winter of 1013, England stopped believing in itself. Cities opened their gates without resistance. Nobles pledged loyalty to a king they barely knew. And the man who was supposed to defend the kingdom slipped silently across the sea, leaving a vacuum behind. The conqueror who stepped into that void didn't arrive as a hero. He arrived as inevitability. His name was Svein Forkbeard. History often shrinks him to a footnote, a Viking who ruled briefly and died quickly. But that view misses the point entirely. Svein's significance wasn't measured in months on a throne. It was measured in the collapse he inherited. This isn't a tale of axes or burning villages. It's a story of fear overtaking loyalty, of wealth buying obedience, of a kingdom forgetting why its people obeyed kings at all. To understand Svein, we must understand the fragile England he entered. When the kingdom fell, he didn't push it over. He simply walked into a crown that had already begun to crumble. In the late 10th century, England seemed unusually still. This wasn't the England of relentless raids or endless noble uprisings. It was a kingdom held together not by swords, but by laws, coins, taxes, and ritual. Under King Edgar, power wasn't announced with violence. It was demonstrated through reliability. Justice was expected, not feared. Borders were monitored, not contested. The king traveled through his lands not as a conqueror, but as a living emblem of order. But peace has its own hidden danger. When fear of violence fades, so does vigilance. Generations grow accustomed to calm, mistaking stability for inevitability. Armies shrink, fortifications decay, and authority becomes something people assume they'll always have, rather than something they understand could vanish. England didn't see it yet, but it had created a system entirely dependent on belief. And belief is fragile, because the moment people doubt a king's ability to protect them, no law, no ceremony, no legacy of peace can hold him in power. Order depends not only on force, it depends on faith. And faith, once lost, can unravel a kingdom faster than any invader ever could. Edgar the Peaceful ruled without spectacle. He did not conquer England, he preserved it. Regional lords pledged loyalty not because they feared slaughter, but because they participated in ritual and tradition. Kings rode Edgar's ceremonial barge. Nobles bowed in silent acknowledgement. Ceremonies took the place of swords and law replaced raids. This created a remarkable illusion that violence was no longer necessary. England appeared stable, orderly, even inevitable in its calm. Justice was predictable. Borders were respected. Power seemed permanent. Yet beneath this calm lay a fragile truth. Edgar's authority depended entirely on perception. It was personal, tied to his presence, his reputation, and the collective belief that he could enforce order. Remove that belief, and the carefully maintained system could unravel. Over time, generations grew accustomed to peace. They began to mistake stability for certainty, assuming England would endure because it always had. Armies shrank, defenses loosened, and the awe-inspiring rituals that sustained loyalty became routine, almost invisible. Edgar had built a kingdom that worked brilliantly, but only as long as people believed in it. Because authority, once grounded in trust rather than fear, can be both its greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. And when that belief falters, no ceremony, no law, no legacy of peace can stop a kingdom from collapsing. When Edgar died, England confronted a challenge it had long forgotten how to navigate: succession. His heir was a child, fragile and inexperienced, and the kingdom was suddenly exposed. Powerful factions moved swiftly, old rivalries resurfaced, and ambitions long kept in check ignited. What had once been a predictable system of governance became a volatile arena of intrigue. Edward the Martyr ascended the throne, but his reign was brief, fragile, and steeped in violence. Nobles maneuvered for advantage, alliances shifted, and the crown, once a symbol of enduring authority, became a prize contested behind closed doors. Then Edward was murdered. In that single act, a boundary was crossed. Kingship, once sacred and unquestioned, no longer commanded automatic loyalty. Authority was no longer absolute. It had become negotiable, conditional, and fragile. This moment matters more than any Viking raid or battlefield conquest. Svein Forkbeard would later benefit from the cracks this created, stepping into a kingdom already destabilized from within. England had crossed a line it could never fully uncross. The perception of power, the sanctity of kingship, and the trust between ruler and ruled had been broken. Once the crown could be taken from its rightful holder without consequence, the entire system of authority was changed forever. When Edward the Martyr was murdered, England didn't just lose a king. It lost the sense that kingship was untouchable. For generations, English rulers had relied on something more enduring than armies: reverence. The belief that the king existed above ordinary quarrels, that his authority was sacred and unquestioned. That faith had endured invasions, rebellions, and dynastic struggles. But murder changes the rules. Edward's death sent a silent, unsettling message through the kingdom. The crown could be taken, not by God, not by destiny, but by people. Kingship was no longer inviolable. Authority had become conditional. When Æthelred was crowned, he inherited this fragile reality. He did not step into stability, he stepped into suspicion. Every order was scrutinized, every judgment questioned, every mistake remembered. The crown remained gold, but it had lost its aura of sanctity. This mattered because medieval kings did not rule by bureaucracy alone. They ruled through belief. Once belief erodes, authority must be maintained through fear, persuasion, or wealth. Æthelred would attempt all three, and each attempt would fail. The kingdom that once obeyed out of respect now obeyed reluctantly. The foundations of loyalty had been shaken, and England was about to discover how dangerous it was to crown a king without certainty in his power. Æthelred's problem was not intelligence, it was temperament. He inherited a kingdom that demanded steady judgment, careful strategy, and patience. Instead, he ruled with suspicion and haste. Advisors rose and fell with alarming speed. Policies shifted abruptly. Punishments were severe but inconsistent. To the nobility, this was more than inconvenient, it was dangerous. A strict king could be endured, but an unpredictable one was lethal. Trust began to splinter. Some nobles obeyed only under watchful eyes. Others quietly plotted alternatives. Many simply waited, biding their time, unsure where loyalty was safest. Æthelred, aware of possible betrayal, often created it himself. Every perceived slight, every rumor became reason for punishment. Instead of reinforcing bonds, he drove wedges. Instead of building alliances, he isolated himself. And when external threats arrived, Vikings crossing the North Sea, fleets at the coast, England discovered how fragile its royal authority had become. Because when real danger looms, people stop asking who holds the crown. They ask a simpler, more urgent question: who can protect them? A king without the trust of his people may have gold, armies, and law at his command, but without belief, none of it matters. Æthelred had learned this too late, and the kingdom would soon pay the price. The Vikings who returned to England in the late 10th century were no longer the chaotic raiders of earlier generations. They were organized, disciplined, political. Raiding had evolved. It was no longer only about plunder, it was about leverage. Every attack was calculated, every withdrawal deliberate, every coastal strike a message. England was wealthy, fractured, and cautious. Æthelred's response was not reform. It was payment, Danegeld. Silver flowed outward while strength eroded inward. Armies were left underfunded, defenses weakened, and trust in royal authority began to slip. Each payment bought time, but it also delivered a harsh lesson. England could be pressured. England could be negotiated with. England would pay to avoid war. To the Vikings, this was opportunity. They had learned that fear and patience could extract far more than swords ever could. To the English people, it felt different. It was humiliation wrapped in the guise of peace. A kingdom that once prided itself on law, order, and loyalty now bowed to foreign gold. Respect for the crown weakened as wealth became the measure of authority. Every coin paid was a reminder. Power could be bought, and obedience could be coerced without a battle. The age of raiding had ended, but the era of compromise, coercion, and fragile authority had only just begun. England would never view security the same way again. Danegeld did more than empty the royal treasury. It reshaped the very foundation of loyalty. When a king pays his enemies instead of defeating them, he sends a subtle, dangerous message to his own people. Protection is conditional. If a ruler cannot guarantee safety, why risk life and honor to defend him? Local leaders began to think strategically. Some negotiated quietly with invaders, hedging their bets. Others withheld troops, testing which side might offer greater advantage. Some simply prepared to abandon the crown entirely if circumstances demanded. Authority began to fracture, not in dramatic rebellions or public uprisings, but in quiet, persistent ways. Loyalty became transactional. Obedience was no longer instinctive, it was calculated. Æthelred still wore the crown and the symbols of kingship remained intact. But power, the real force behind law, loyalty, and order, had become negotiable. And negotiation always favors the strong. Each payment of silver, meant to buy peace, instead reminded the kingdom who truly held influence, the one who could enforce it. Æthelred's Danegeld offered a temporary reprieve from violence, but it also revealed a permanent weakness. The crown could sit upon his head, but the allegiance of the kingdom was no longer guaranteed. Authority had shifted subtly, irreversibly, toward those who understood that might, strategy, and timing could outweigh ceremony and heritage. As raids swept across the land, confidence gave way to fear, and fear spreads faster than any army. Villages abandoned their fields. Towns built walls and watchtowers on their own. Trade slowed and communication between regions frayed. Trust, once the glue holding England together, began to dissolve. The kingdom, which had relied on shared loyalty and law, fragmented into anxious, self-preserving communities, each focused on its own survival. Æthelred issued commands, proclamations, and directives, but they were followed only selectively. Where fear dominates, a king's words carry little weight. Authority relies on belief as much as force, and when people no longer believe they will be protected, obedience falters. England had stopped thinking as a unified kingdom. It began thinking as individuals, families, and towns, each calculating risks, each hedging against potential threats. The collective vision of the nation faded into a patchwork of isolated priorities. The crown sat on Æthelred's head, and the symbols of authority remained. But the spirit of the kingdom, The shared sense of belonging, trust, and loyalty was unraveling. And in that vacuum, fear became the true ruler, shaping decisions, alliances, and survival strategies more effectively than any king could. The question was no longer whether the kingdom could defend itself. It was whether anyone still believed it could. From the outside, England appeared strong. It had wealth, sprawling lands, and centuries of history. Its cities bustled, its fields produced, and its crown gleamed with tradition. To a distant observer, the kingdom seemed unshakable. But true power is not measured in gold, acreage, or lineage. Power exists in what people believe will protect them tomorrow. And in Æthelred's England, that belief was crumbling. The king still wore the crown, issued decrees, and held ceremony. But fewer and fewer subjects trusted that he could deliver on his promises. Commands went unheeded, fortifications were built independently, and nobles began making their own calculations. Authority had become conditional, fragile, and easily questioned. It is in moments like these that desperation seeps into policy. Decisions are made not for strategy or long-term stability, but for immediate survival. Every choice becomes reactive, every measure hurried, every decree a gamble. Æthelred's kingdom still looked formidable on paper, but the real test of a ruler, whether people obey because they believe in protection and justice, was failing. And when belief collapses, even the wealthiest, most storied kingdom can feel dangerously powerless. England's gold, history, and land mattered little if no one trusted the crown to keep them safe. In 1002, Æthelred made a choice that would reverberate far beyond the borders of England. Fearing that Danish settlers living within his realm might betray him, he issued an order for their slaughter. Men, women, children. The decree was ruthless, intended to strike fear and eliminate perceived threats. Its enforcement was chaotic at best, impossible at worst. Entire communities were targeted, trust shattered, and the fabric of society strained to breaking. This was not an act of strength. It was fear weaponized, a desperate attempt to assert control over a kingdom already slipping from his grasp. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Æthelred's moral authority, already fragile from years of inconsistent rule and failed payments to Viking invaders, collapsed further. Nobles questioned loyalty. Citizens questioned protection. The king had traded legitimacy for terror, and the price would be severe. Across the North Sea, eyes were watching. Among them was a man who understood opportunity when it appeared, a man who would exploit England's fear, division, and weakened authority. The seeds of consequence were sown in the winter of 1002. Æthelred's attempt to secure his kingdom through brutality did not make him safer. It made him vulnerable, and the kingdom he ruled, already fragile and fragmented, now had an enemy waiting for the right moment to strike. In Denmark, news traveled faster than any fleet. Svein Forkbeard did not need to invent a reason to strike England. Æthelred had handed him one. The massacre of 1002 transformed what had once been opportunistic raids into a campaign of vengeance. What had been intermittent attacks now carried purpose, justification, and moral weight. Suddenly, the conflict had a story, a narrative that could be wielded as skillfully as swords or ships. And kings, above all, understand the power of narrative. Svein stepped into that story not merely as a warrior, but as an avenger. Every raid, every landing, every claim became a chapter in a tale of retribution. England's fear and Æthelred's missteps gave his cause legitimacy in the eyes of his followers, while sowing panic across the North Sea and within English towns. No longer just a Viking leader seeking plunder, Svein now carried the mantle of justice. albeit through blood and steel. The crown he pursued was not just a prize. It was the stage on which a narrative of vengeance could unfold, reshaping perceptions of power, authority, and inevitability. Æthelred had made his kingdom vulnerable. Svein would turn that vulnerability into opportunity, and England would soon discover that avengers, once armed with narrative, are almost impossible to stop. Svein was not born into stability or certainty. His father, Harald Bluetooth, ruled Denmark during a time of upheaval. Religion was shifting, Christian influence was spreading, and traditional loyalties were fracturing. The kingdom was in flux, and leadership was as much about navigating chaos as it was about holding a crown. Svein learned early that kingship was not a gift passed from parent to child. It was something to be earned or taken. Authority was fragile, and waiting for tradition to secure power was a dangerous gamble. He rebelled against his father, challenging the very foundation of inherited rule. Through strategy, force, and relentless determination, Svein forced Harald from power. He emerged victorious, not only surviving a dangerous gamble, but establishing himself as a ruler in his own right. This experience left an indelible mark. Svein understood that authority is not granted by birthright, ceremony, or lineage. It is claimed through action, reinforced by respect, and maintained through decisiveness. Every decision, every campaign, every confrontation would be measured against that early lesson. A crown is only as secure as the strength and resolve of the one who wears it. Svein's life proved that ambition, timing, and ruthless clarity were more reliable than tradition or expectation in the treacherous game of kingship. And it was this understanding that would later guide him to England. Svein was not a king of impulse. He did not act on whim, rage, or fleeting ambition. He planned, he observed, he waited. Every move was calculated, every decision measured against both opportunity and consequence. Patience was his weapon, foresight his shield. England did not become a target by accident. It was not a prize stumbled upon during a raid or a fleeting thought in a Viking council. It was a long-term objective, a goal nurtured over years, shaped by observation of the kingdom's weaknesses, and defined by the vulnerabilities of those who ruled it. Svein watched from across the North Sea as Æthelred's reign faltered. He noted the fractures within the nobility, the erosion of trust, the fear seeded by repeated Danegeld payments. England was rich, divided, and ripe for someone who understood that conquest is as much about timing and perception as it is about ships and swords. Every delay, every pause, every fleet that stayed docked was part of a larger strategy. Svein's actions were never reactive. They were deliberate, designed to exploit opportunity when it finally aligned with preparation. This was not a raid. This was a campaign years in the making. England was not a fleeting target. It was a vision Svein had nurtured, and one he would seize with precision when the moment was right. Over the years, each raid became more than a strike. It became a rehearsal. Supply lines were tested, troop movements observed, defenses probed. Every response from England's forces, every delay or misstep, was noted and analyzed. Svein treated each encounter not as an isolated attack, but as a lesson in strategy, patience, and the psychology of power. Weaknesses were mapped with precision. Gaps in coordination, fractured loyalties among nobles, and the slow response of local garrisons revealed patterns that no single battle report could provide. England was not a fortress. It was a puzzle, and Svein was learning its pieces. He understood that a divided kingdom could rarely respond with speed or unity. Messages took time to travel, decisions were debated, and fear often outweighed action. Hesitation was England's greatest vulnerability. A single pause, a single misjudgment could turn advantage into disaster. Svein waited for that moment. He knew that conquest was not about brute force alone. It was about timing, perception, and exploiting the cracks that slow, uncertain leadership created. Each attack refined his understanding. Each skirmish sharpened his strategy. England, rich and fragmented, would not fall through chaos alone. It would fall because Svein had prepared, studied, and learned every lesson the kingdom had unknowingly offered. Patience, observation, and precision made inevitability his ally. By the early 1010s, England was exhausted, not broken by a single battle, not crushed under a foreign army, just worn down, piece by piece, year after year. Gold had flowed out of the treasury to buy temporary peace. Fields had been scorched, livelihoods disrupted, and towns fortified not by order but by fear. Repeated raids, inconsistent leadership, and fractured loyalties had left the kingdom frayed. Trust, once the backbone of authority, had eroded quietly but relentlessly. Nobles hedged their bets. Communities looked inward. The crown's words carried less weight, and obedience had become conditional. England was not ripe for simple conquest. It was ready for replacement. Its structures were intact, its people still capable, but the belief that the king could protect them had faltered. Authority no longer commanded respect by tradition alone. It had to be earned, enforced, or replaced. Svein Forkbeard did not need to storm walls or burn cities to claim the crown. The kingdom, fatigued and divided, was already vulnerable. England's exhaustion was an invitation. Its fractures were opportunities. And in this environment, a decisive, calculating leader could step in not merely to raid, but to rule. The stage was set, and all that remained was for the right man to arrive. By the early 1010s, England's nobles were asking themselves a question that carried life-or-death weight. Who will still be standing next year? The certainty that had once surrounded the crown was gone. Æthelred no longer felt inevitable. His authority, once assumed, had been chipped away by years of missteps, fear, and the relentless pressure of external threats. Commands went unanswered, loyalty became conditional, and every decision he made was second-guessed. The throne was his in name only. Across the North Sea, a different sense of inevitability was taking shape. Svein Forkbeard understood power in ways Æthelred no longer could. He had honed his authority through action, strategy, and the careful cultivation of fear and respect. Where Æthelred hesitated, Svein acted. Where the English king floundered, Svein observed and learned. For the nobles, the contrast was stark. One king appeared fragile, reactive, and worn down. The other exuded decisiveness, patience, and a clear vision of opportunity. Choices were made not merely out of loyalty, but survival. In that moment, allegiance was no longer automatic. It had become a calculation. Æthelred could command the crown, but Svein commanded inevitability. And in a kingdom already fraying at the edges, inevitability often wins. By 1013, all the pieces were in place, not for a traditional conquest marked by roaring battles and blazing cities. For something quieter, more insidious, collapse. England was already unraveling from within almost imperceptibly. The crown still sat on Æthelred's head, armies still lined the coast, and towns still had walls. Yet the spirit of the kingdom, the shared trust and belief that had once held it together, was fading. Loyalty had become transactional. Nobles hedged their bets, citizens protected themselves first, and the king's commands were measured against immediate survival rather than respect or reverence. The institutions that had once enforced order were now hollow frameworks, functional only when people chose to believe in them. Fear, fatigue, and uncertainty had replaced confidence. Fields went untended, towns fortified independently, and agreements that once seemed binding were ignored or quietly renegotiated. England's surrender was not dramatic. It was internal, subtle, and almost invisible to the casual observer. Svein Forkbeard did not need to storm the gates to claim victory. England had already begun to yield. The crown, the people, the loyalty, all were slipping quietly out of Æthelred's grasp, waiting only for the man who understood how to seize what was already crumbling. Svein's fleet was not vast. It didn't boast hundreds of ships or an army that could overwhelm a kingdom by sheer numbers. Its strength was something subtler, something far more effective than scale. Its power came from timing. Every ship, every crew, every maneuver was calculated to exploit England's weakness. The kingdom was fractured, weary, and uncertain. Supplies were stretched, defenses scattered, and morale fragile. Svein did not need to outfight the English. He needed to strike when hesitation had already done half the work for him. Years of observation had taught him the rhythms of the kingdom. When orders were ignored, when fear spread, when loyalty wavered. He understood that the appearance of inevitability could be as deadly as the clash of swords. His fleet, arriving at the right moment, amplified the sense that resistance was futile, that authority had shifted, and that the crown might as well belong to him. This was not a gamble. It was precision. It was strategy. It was the culmination of decades of patience and study. Svein's arrival was a signal more than an invasion. It announced that the time for uncertainty was over, and that those who had already begun to surrender quietly would find the transition both swift and undeniable. England did not panic. There were no frantic calls to arms, no desperate barricades thrown up in a night. There was no chaos in the streets, not because the people were brave, but because panic requires a foundation, a belief that resistance can make a difference. And that belief was gone. Years of weak leadership, repeated Danegeld payments, inconsistent enforcement, and fear had hollowed out the kingdom's confidence. Æthelred's crown still sat upon his head, but it no longer carried weight. Commands were measured, obedience conditional, and trust had fractured quietly but irreversibly. Communities did not mobilize together. Nobles did not coordinate. England had become a collection of isolated, anxious pockets, each calculating its own survival, each unwilling to risk much for a king whose ability to protect them had long been in doubt. Svein's approach did not need to rely on overwhelming force. He did not need to inspire terror or stage dramatic sieges. The kingdom's internal collapse did the work for him. Resistance, once instinctive, was replaced by resignation. Action was replaced by calculation. The crown, the army, the institutions, all remained in place, but the spirit that once animated them had vanished. England no longer believed it could fight, and in that absence of belief, Svein's arrival was unstoppable. As Svein crossed the North Sea, England waited, not in hope, not in anticipation of salvation or deliverance. The kingdom had long since learned that such expectations were fragile, easily broken by indecision, betrayal, or failed leadership. England waited for something far more immediate and unavoidable: resolution. The uncertainty that had gripped towns, villages, and courts for years was about to meet a force that would settle the question of authority once and for all. The difference between salvation and resolution is subtle, but in history, it is decisive. Salvation offers hope, a chance to restore what was lost. Resolution demands reckoning, forces choices, and imposes consequences. And England, exhausted, fractured, and uncertain, was now facing a reckoning. Nobles measured their allegiances. Citizens weighed survival over loyalty. Æthelred clung to a crown that symbolized authority but no longer commanded belief. Every hesitation, every misstep over the preceding decade had concentrated power in the hands of the one who understood timing, patience, and perception. Svein Forkbeard. As the fleet approached, the kingdom realized the truth. This was not a raid. This was not a temporary threat. This was the moment when indecision would end, when fragile belief would be tested, and when the crown itself would be redefined. The outcome would be determined not by battle alone, but by who the people now believed could hold power. When Svein Forkbeard's fleet arrived on English shores, something remarkable occurred. Almost nothing. There were no sweeping coastal battles, no heroic last stands, no massive armies rushing to repel him. Instead, Svein landed into quiet. Villages, towns, and fortifications remained still. Local leaders observed cautiously. Messengers carried reports, hesitated, and delayed. Decisions were made behind closed doors, quietly, with careful calculation rather than open defiance. This was not the invasion anyone had imagined. There was no spectacle, no chaos, no immediate demonstration of force. But this was not an invasion defined by shock. It was defined by inevitability. Svein did not need to prove his strength with blood and fire. England, weakened by years of mismanagement, fear, and fractured loyalty, had already proven it could not mount effective resistance. The kingdom's own hesitation, exhaustion, and internal collapse had done the work for him, and the realization spread faster than any army. It rippled through towns and courts alike. The crown was no longer untouchable, authority was negotiable, and the outcome could no longer be resisted. Svein's landing was quiet, almost unremarkable in action, but it marked the moment when inevitability replaced hope, when the kingdom understood that the course of power had already shifted, long before a single sword was drawn. The first regions to submit to Svein Forkbeard were not the weakest. They were the most pragmatic. Northern England, accustomed to the presence and influence of Scandinavian power for generations, understood exactly what Svein represented. His arrival was not a gamble. It was a calculated assertion of inevitability. Local leaders did not pause to debate legitimacy. They did not ask whether Svein had a rightful claim to the throne. Their question was far simpler and far more consequential. Did Æthelred still command authority, loyalty, and protection? For many, the answer was already clear: no. Oaths were pledged, hostages were offered, supplies were provided. Towns and fortifications opened gates quietly, not in fear of immediate slaughter, but in acknowledgement of a shifting balance of power. Svein accepted these acts of submission without violence. Cruelty was unnecessary. England, fractured and exhausted, was making its choice without the need for force. This was not conquest in the traditional sense. It was authority recognized where it was most effective, earned through inevitability rather than terror. Across the northern counties, the pattern was set. England was choosing its future, and in doing so it confirmed what Svein already knew. The crown would follow the path of certainty, not resistance. The kingdom's surrender was not dramatic. It was practical, deliberate, and irreversible. Once a single region submitted, neutrality vanished. Neighbors could no longer remain indifferent. To resist was to stand alone, exposed and vulnerable. The choice became immediate and stark: follow the path of pragmatism or face potential isolation. Svein Forkbeard understood this principle perfectly. He did not rush. He did not rely on brute force or displays of overwhelming might. Instead, he moved with patience, deliberately, allowing news of each submission to travel ahead of him. Word of oaths sworn, hostages delivered, and provisions offered spread quickly, creating the perception that resistance was not just futile, it was dangerous. Every act of compliance amplified the inevitability of his campaign. Each town that opened its gates quietly reinforced the lesson. Survival required recognition of power, not defiance. And in this environment, opposition became unthinkable. The longer someone hesitated, the clearer the message became. To resist was not a noble choice, but a fatal one. Svein did not need to conquer through fear alone. He harnessed momentum, perception, and human instinct, turning submission into a cascade that carried the crown toward him almost effortlessly. In this moment, resistance looked not merely unwise, it looked suicidal. England, already fractured and weary, was yielding without a fight, and Svein's inevitability had become undeniable. As England began to shift under Svein's advance, its king faltered. Æthelred did not raise a grand army. He did not issue a decisive proclamation or rally his nobles around a unifying purpose. Instead, he waited, hesitated, while the momentum of inevitability grew stronger with every passing day. And in this moment, hesitation was no longer neutral. It became a symbol, a visible sign of weakness. Where decisive action might have inspired confidence, inaction inspired doubt. Nobles calculated loyalties not on promises or tradition, but on survival. Citizens measured their obedience against the likelihood of protection. The crown remained on Æthelred's head, but its authority had begun to erode. Kings must act before action becomes symbolic. Authority is not merely inherited or displayed. It is enacted, reinforced by timing, decisiveness, and perception. Delay transforms power into vulnerability. Æthelred's failure was not in battle, it was in timing. By waiting, he allowed the story of inevitability to be written by Svein, not himself. By the time he acted, the moment for decisive leadership had passed. The king remained, the crown remained, but the spirit of command, the belief that could compel loyalty and obedience, had already shifted elsewhere. Æthelred acted too late, and the consequences would echo across England forever. London did not surrender at once. It resisted, not out of loyalty to Æthelred, not from courage or principle, but out of calculation. The city was wealthy, fortified, and confident. Its walls had held for centuries, its defenses were well maintained, and its leaders believed they could endure. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as if England might still fight, that the crown and its loyal subjects could rally. Svein Forkbeard approached not with reckless force, but with measured strategy. He tested the city, observing its responses, gauging its strength, and understanding the mindset of its leaders. He did not need to take it by storm, for that would have been unnecessary and costly. Instead, he moved on, leaving London standing. This was no retreat. It was a deliberate choice. Svein understood that timing mattered as much as strength, that the perception of inevitability could be more powerful than any siege engine. By bypassing the city, he allowed fear and calculation to do the work for him. London watched as the surrounding regions submitted, as neighboring nobles swore oaths and offered hostages. The message was clear. Resistance could only delay the inevitable. And that single, deliberate decision, to avoid confrontation now, would carry more weight than any assault, shaping the course of England's surrender and demonstrating that conquest is often won not by force, but by strategy. Eventually, Æthelred made a choice that would define his reign. He fled, not to rally, not to regroup, but across the sea to Normandy. It was the quietest abdication imaginable. No dramatic battle, no fiery confrontation. just a king slipping away, leaving a kingdom behind. Yet in its quietness, it spoke louder than any army could. It was the loudest admission of failure. Æthelred's crown remained in name, but the authority it symbolized had vanished. Command without belief is powerless, and by leaving he stripped the throne of its most essential force, the faith of those it ruled. A king who flees abandons more than land or palace walls. He abandons confidence, loyalty, and trust. He leaves behind the very belief that makes obedience natural and authority real. Across England, the consequences were immediate. Nobles and towns, already calculating their own survival, saw the crown as a relic, not a protector. Citizens followed pragmatism over principle. Æthelred's flight crystallized a truth that had been developing over a decade. Leadership is only as strong as the belief it inspires. In leaving, he did not just vacate a throne. He handed the kingdom to someone who understood that authority is earned, observed, and seized. The stage was now set for Svein Forkbeard, and England would never look back the same way again. England awoke to a kingdom without a ruler, not in law, not on paper, but in practice. Authority had evaporated in the absence of decisive leadership. The crown remained, gilded and ceremonial, yet the power it symbolized had already moved elsewhere. Power does not linger for ceremony, for coronations, or for titles. It flows to those capable of asserting it, maintaining it, and commanding recognition. In a land fractured by fear, fatigue, and uncertainty, legitimacy alone was insufficient. What mattered was the ability to enforce, protect, and inspire belief. Svein Forkbeard understood this principle as clearly as any strategist. He did not wait for England to decide whether it would resist or submit. He stepped forward, calmly, deliberately, and with a clarity that contrasted sharply with the hesitation of those who had worn the crown before him. The kingdom's internal collapse had done much of the work. Nobles calculated loyalty not from oath or tradition, but from observation, watching the man who could act, enforce, and secure what others had failed to protect. In the quiet of England's awakening, Svein became the embodiment of authority. The crown, the kingdom, and the allegiance of its people were no longer abstract concepts. They were his to claim, simply because he understood that power belongs to the one willing and able to seize it. Svein Forkbeard was proclaimed King of England, but there was no coronation to mark the moment. No sacred oil anointed a forehead. No ancient ritual validated his authority in the eyes of centuries of tradition. What existed instead was far simpler and far more powerful: acceptance. Acceptance from nobles who had measured loyalty against survival. Acceptance from towns and communities who recognized that resistance was futile. Acceptance from a kingdom that had already surrendered quietly, internally, long before Svein set foot on the throne. In this moment, authority was not defined by ceremony or ceremony's weight. It was defined by recognition, by the understanding that power belongs to the one who can hold it, enforce it, and inspire belief. Svein's crown was legitimized not by oil or ritual, but by the acknowledgement of those it governed. Sometimes, acceptance is stronger than tradition. It moves faster, requires less spectacle, and leaves no room for doubt. It transforms inevitability into reality. Svein understood that rule is less about symbols and more about perception. A kingdom that believes in its ruler is more powerful than any crown consecrated by ritual. By claiming what England had already yielded, Svein Forkbeard became king, not because history decreed it, but because the kingdom itself had chosen him. Svein ruled through presence. He did not rely solely on proclamations or letters. He did not govern from a distant seat of power. Instead, he traveled across the kingdom, moving where the eyes of nobles, towns, and communities could see him, reminding them that authority was not abstract. It was immediate, tangible, and personal. He inspected fortifications, met with local leaders, and made his presence felt in a way that left no doubt. He was in control. Every visit, every appearance, reinforced the understanding that power was no longer a distant concept tied to ceremony. It was embodied, enforced, and observed in real time. That alone was enough. Svein understood that in a kingdom fractured by fear and exhaustion, the perception of authority mattered as much as its execution. By simply being seen, he commanded obedience, loyalty, and respect more effectively than any army could. His presence reminded England that leadership is active, visible, and immediate. Æthelred's failures, the kingdom's fatigue, and Svein's careful strategy had set the stage. Now, all that was required to maintain control was to exist within the kingdom as the embodiment of inevitability. Through presence, Svein did not merely rule. He became the center of England's attention, the axis around which loyalty and obedience naturally revolved. Life went on. Markets opened as usual. Courthouses functioned. Orders were obeyed. People went about their daily routines as if nothing had changed. The streets of towns still bustled, trade continued along rivers and roads, and communities maintained the rhythms of life they had relied on for generations. The machinery of a kingdom, from taxation to justice, kept moving. The world did not end, but that continuity was dangerous, more dangerous than chaos or outright rebellion because it masked the subtle shift in power. The crown sat on Svein Forkbeard's head, yet daily life carried on as if Æthelred's failures had never happened. The people, accustomed to survival over principle, adapted quickly to the new reality. Obedience became routine, not a demonstration of loyalty. Authority was accepted, not tested. This calm, this normalcy, allowed Svein's rule to solidify without dramatic struggle. There were no uprisings, no rebellions, no grand challenges to his authority. England surrendered quietly, almost invisibly, as the kingdom itself moved from one ruler to another without recognizing the change. In this subtle acceptance lay the true power of conquest. It is not always the clash of swords or the fall of walls that defines control. Sometimes, the greatest authority comes from the quiet knowledge that life continues, and no one dares disrupt it. Svein understood that his position was fragile. He ruled a conquered kingdom, but conquest alone does not guarantee loyalty. The land had not chosen him. It had submitted to inevitability. Authority was thinly held, conditional, and untested by the passage of time. There were no deep roots in the soil of England to anchor his rule. No centuries of lineage, no ancestral claims, no sacred ceremonies to validate his crown. The people had recognized his power, but recognition is different from devotion. Acceptance is different from reverence. Without these foundations, every decision carried weight, every delay carried risk, and every misstep could unravel the fragile web of obedience he had inherited. Svein's authority existed in the present, observed, enforced, and constantly reaffirmed. Time, more than any army, was his enemy. Each day the kingdom remained divided. Each moment that nobles or towns debated loyalty, his grip weakened. He knew he could not rely on inevitability alone forever. To consolidate power, he would need patience, foresight, and constant presence. Svein ruled not just through conquest, but through vigilance. Every journey across his kingdom, every inspection, every visible act of authority was a reminder. Power is not only seized, it must be maintained. In England, Svein's crown was secure only as long as he reminded everyone that it was. Svein compensated for what he lacked in legitimacy with what he could command: control. He understood that a crown without roots, without tradition, ceremony, or ancestral claim requires active reinforcement. Authority cannot rest on recognition alone. It must be observed, enforced, and sometimes imposed. To achieve this, he relied on a combination of practical measures. Hostages were taken, ensuring the compliance of influential families and nobles. Garrisons were stationed strategically, reinforcing obedience and reminding communities that authority could be immediate and unavoidable. Every town, every stronghold, every critical passage was under direct oversight, leaving no room for hesitation or independent action. These measures were efficient. They maintained order and projected power across the kingdom. They made the abstract concept of rule concrete, visible, and undeniable. Yet Svein knew they were temporary. Control enforced through fear and presence is effective, but fragile. It does not create lasting loyalty or belief. Authority grounded only in observation will erode if the ruler fails to consolidate it through legitimacy, alliances, or integration with local customs. For Svein, every act of control was both a necessity and a reminder. Power is never absolute. It must be actively managed. The crown could be held, but only if he continually reminded England that his presence and his will were inescapable. England waited, not in hope of rebellion, not in expectation of an uprising or a return to the old order. The kingdom had been through too much to expect heroics or miracles. It waited to see if Svein would endure. The crown rested on his head, but authority is never guaranteed. Conquest is only the first step. Maintaining power requires observation, patience, and subtle reinforcement. The people, the nobles, the communities, they all understood this. They had surrendered, yes, but surrender is not the same as trust. They were watching, calculating, measuring every action to determine if the new king could sustain his rule. Every inspection, every garrison, every decree was under scrutiny. Obedience was conditional, compliance cautious. The memory of Æthelred's failures lingered like a shadow, a reminder that crowns can be lost quietly without battle. Svein understood this. He did not rely on fear alone. He moved deliberately, ensured visibility, and reinforced the inevitability of his presence. England's patience was a test. It was silent, yet absolute, and in that silence a truth emerged. The kingdom would bend to whoever demonstrated that authority could endure, that leadership was steady, and that power was more than momentary conquest. Svein's challenge was not to fight England, it was to prove he could last. Winter deepened across England. The cold was relentless, pressing harder than any army, harder than any siege. It reminded rulers, armies, and citizens alike that power is tested not only in battle but in endurance. Supplies dwindled, roads froze, and the demands of governance became heavier with every day. Even a king accustomed to action could feel the weight of the season pressing against him. Svein Forkbeard, once a figure of unstoppable momentum, began to show signs of strain. Years of campaigns, of calculated movements, of constant vigilance had taken their toll. The winter did not distinguish between conqueror and conquered. It measured stamina, resilience, and the limits of human endurance. His health began to fail. The sharpness of his judgment, the precision of his presence, the certainty of his authority, all subtly threatened by fatigue and fever. The same inevitability he had wielded over England was now tested against his own body. And yet, even in decline, his presence continued to command attention. Garrisoned towns, wary nobles, and cautious citizens still recognized the weight of his authority. Winter might weaken the man, but it could not immediately erase the power he had already established. England, already reshaped by his arrival, waited silently. The kingdom had surrendered to his inevitability, and even as Svein faltered, the structures of his rule endured, fragile yet unbroken. Illness can do what armies, rebellions, and conspiracies cannot. It isolates, it slows, it diminishes presence, and in leadership, absence is dangerous. Svein Forkbeard, whose authority had been solidified through visibility, vigilance, and action, was suddenly constrained by his own failing health. He withdrew from the front lines of governance. Travel slowed. Inspections were delayed. Orders were issued from a distance rather than reinforced by presence. Every day spent in recovery subtly shifted the balance. Authority, once immediate and tangible, became mediated, abstract, and subject to interpretation. England noticed. The kingdom, already weary and calculating, watched closely. Nobles measured loyalties. Communities weighed obedience against their own interests. Where Svein had once been an unstoppable force, his absence raised questions, small at first, almost imperceptible but dangerous in accumulation. The illusion of inevitability, so carefully cultivated over months, showed cracks. Even a king whose power is earned through strategy and patience is vulnerable to the fragility of the human body. Svein's illness did not diminish the authority he had already claimed, but it reminded England and himself that control depends as much on presence as it does on conquest. Isolation, observation, and subtle doubt began to take root, creating a tension that armies alone could never provoke. Whispers traveled faster than any official decree. Was Svein Forkbeard truly dying? In a kingdom already fragile and cautious, even a hint of weakness spread like wildfire. Towns, villages, and courts listened, watched, and recalculated. Every rumor, no matter how small, became a test of loyalty, a measure of opportunity. Could England shift again? Could the crown, which had passed silently from Æthelred to Svein, change hands once more? Nobles considered alliances. Local leaders weighed survival over principle. Citizens speculated, measured, and observed. The machinery of governance, efficient and orderly under Svein's presence, now felt uncertain, vulnerable, and suspended in tension. The possibility of upheaval, of another change in leadership, was not distant. It hovered in conversations, in quiet meetings, in eyes scanning horizons for signs of movement. What was once inevitable now had cracks. Svein's authority, earned through strategy, presence, and the careful management of perception, was suddenly confronted with a new challenge: human fragility. Death or illness could undo years of carefully cultivated inevitability faster than any rebellion or army. England waited, not in anticipation but in calculation. Every observer understood that power, no matter how decisive, is never permanent. And in that waiting, the kingdom's future hung delicately in the balance. In February of 1014, Svein Forkbeard died. No battle heralded his passing. No rebellion tore the kingdom apart. There were no clashing swords, no cries of victory or defeat, just silence. A king who had reshaped a kingdom through presence, strategy, and inevitability was gone. The crown, once a symbol of unquestioned authority, now lay unguarded. Power, so carefully seized and maintained, suddenly became a question rather than a certainty. England, which had watched him arrive with quiet resignation, now faced the opposite tension. What happens when the one who seemed unstoppable disappears? Nobles measured loyalties anew. Towns and villages, long accustomed to obedience, began to calculate survival in the absence of the man who had embodied authority itself. The machinery of rule continued to function, but without the force that had given it coherence and weight. Svein's death reminded the kingdom, and the world, that power, no matter how formidable, is ultimately fragile. It can be built, reinforced, and observed, but it cannot be made immortal. The balance he had maintained through presence, fear, and strategy evaporated instantly, leaving England to confront uncertainty once more. No battle, no rebellion, just silence. And in that silence, the kingdom realized how deeply one man's presence had shaped its fate. Svein's death did not restore England. It did not return the crown to its former order, nor did it suddenly heal the fractures within the kingdom. Instead, it created confusion. Authority that had seemed tangible and inevitable evaporated almost instantly. Where obedience had once flowed from presence, strategy, and perception, now there was only uncertainty. Power vanished overnight. Nobles, towns, and communities that had aligned themselves with Svein now hesitated, unsure whom to follow. Loyalties, once implicit, became questions. Every decision, every oath, every calculation had to be reconsidered. The structures that had maintained order were still there, yet without the man who gave them coherence, they were hollow shells. England found itself suspended between rulers, between hope and pragmatism. Æthelred, exiled but alive, waited. Nobles measured whether to return to the old king or to carve their own paths. The kingdom, which had quietly surrendered to inevitability, now faced a vacuum that was almost palpable. Svein's passing proved a simple, brutal truth. Authority is as fragile as the human life that embodies it. No conquest, no strategy, no presence, no matter how carefully executed, can endure forever. And when the force that holds a kingdom dissolves, even for a moment, confusion spreads faster than armies, rebellion, or proclamation ever could. England did not know what to do next. Æthelred returned to England cautiously. It was not a triumphant march. There were no banners, no armies celebrating a restored king. He came back because he was invited, not because he had reclaimed power, but because the kingdom required his presence under very specific terms. The invitation carried conditions. Nobles demanded guarantees, towns expected security, and the people measured obedience against the likelihood of protection. Æthelred's authority was no longer inherent. It had to be negotiated, monitored, and confirmed. The crown he once held as a symbol of unquestioned power was now conditional, fragile, and dependent on compliance rather than reverence. That alone changed everything. The balance of power had shifted. Leadership was no longer absolute. It was transactional. Obedience was measured, not assumed. Even the king himself had to navigate a landscape that had been reshaped by years of fear, surrender, and the brief but decisive rule of Svein Forkbeard. England, which had once yielded quietly, now demanded terms. The monarchy, once a symbol of inevitability, had become a position that required diplomacy, negotiation, and constant vigilance. Æthelred's return marked not a restoration but a transformation. The crown remained, but its meaning had changed forever. England had learned a lesson that would not fade. Kings could fall. Crowns could be seized or abandoned. Authority, once fractured, could never be fully restored to its former certainty. The kingdom had witnessed the fragile nature of power, not in distant battles, but in the quiet surrender of towns, in the conditional loyalties of nobles, and in the absence of unquestioned reverence. Svein Forkbeard was gone. His life ended quietly, without the drama of swords or rebellion. Yet his presence, carefully cultivated over months of strategy, patience and inevitability, had already reshaped England in ways that outlasted him. The kingdom had seen firsthand that power is as much about perception as it is about force, that leadership depends on belief, and that submission can be both voluntary and pragmatic. Even with the conqueror dead, the echoes of his rule lingered in every calculation, every oath, and every act of obedience. Svein's death did not erase his impact. England retained the memory of his inevitability, the caution he inspired, and the fragile understanding that crowns and kings are only as enduring as the belief they command. The man was gone, but the lesson remained. Æthelred did not return to England as a triumphant king. He returned as a compromise. The nobles who welcomed him back did not act out of loyalty or reverence. They acted out of necessity. England required continuity, even if belief in the crown, and in him, had been deeply shaken. The kingdom could not yet govern itself entirely, but it could dictate the terms under which a king might reclaim his seat. This return came with conditions. Æthelred was expected to promise reform, to govern more justly, to listen more carefully, and to temper punishment with caution rather than fear. For the first time in English history, a king was being readmitted to power through negotiation, not inheritance or force. That simple shift speaks volumes about the transformation of authority. Kingship was no longer automatic, absolute, or unquestioned. It had become conditional, contingent on action, trust, and the perception of competence. Æthelred accepted these terms. He had no choice. The crown remained, but its power had been forever altered. The kingdom that had once yielded quietly now exercised leverage, reminding the returning king, and the world, that even crowns must answer to the people they govern. Authority was no longer inherited. It had to be earned, maintained, and renewed continuously. A king who rules on conditions rules on borrowed time. Every decision carried extraordinary weight. Every misstep, however small, reinforced the doubts that had taken root during years of fear, surrender, and external rule. Authority, once assumed by inheritance, now had to be earned continuously, scrutinized by nobles, towns, and communities alike. Æthelred attempted reform. He sought to govern more justly, to temper punishment with prudence, and to demonstrate that he could be a king worthy of conditional loyalty. Yet trust, once fractured, is slow to heal. Words alone could not repair years of perceived weakness and inconsistency. The kingdom measured his actions against the memory of failure, the shadow of Svein's inevitable rule, and the lingering scars of insecurity. England obeyed, but it observed. Orders were followed, but compliance was cautious. Oaths were renewed, but always with an eye towards survival, not reverence. Every act of governance was monitored, weighed, and silently judged. Æthelred remained on the throne, but the crown no longer carried unquestioned authority. He ruled, but always under the watchful gaze of a kingdom that had learned the hard way. Belief, once broken, is fragile, and power, once conditional, can never again be taken for granted. Svein Forkbeard ruled England for only a short time, yet his presence left a mark that endured far beyond his death. His reign, brief as it was, demonstrated truths that the kingdom could not ignore. He proved that conquest was achievable, not through legendary battles alone, but through strategy, timing, and the careful manipulation of perception. A kingdom could be persuaded, subtly or decisively, to accept a new ruler without the devastation of open conflict. He proved that loyalty was negotiable. Nobles, towns, and communities would follow a king not out of reverence, but because submission aligned with survival and pragmatism. Authority could be earned, observed, and maintained, but it could also be conditional and fragile. Most importantly, he proved that England could change kings without collapsing into chaos. The crown could pass, not through divine sanction or ancestral right alone, but through circumstance, calculation, and inevitability. That realization was permanent. Svein's conquest had altered the kingdom's understanding of power, kingship, and obedience. Even after his death, the memory of his rule continued to shape behavior, influence decisions, and redefine expectations. England had witnessed a new model of authority, and once that understanding took hold, it could never be entirely undone. Svein Forkbeard did not arrive in history as an isolated figure. He left behind a legacy in the form of a son, Cnut. Unlike his father, whose rule was sudden and brief, Cnut observed England from the sidelines. He watched as the kingdom surrendered quietly, as nobles calculated loyalties, and as kings rose and fell with the shifting tides of belief and necessity. He witnessed the collapse of Æthelred's authority, the inevitability of Svein's conquest, and the delicate balance between obedience and fear. Cnut did not simply inherit a throne, he inherited knowledge. He learned how power could be seized not just through force, but through strategy, perception, and timing. He understood that loyalty is conditional, authority is fragile, and conquest is as much about psychology as it is about swords. He saw how England could bend without breaking, how submission could be negotiated, and how a kingdom structure could endure even as crowns changed hands. In observing these lessons, Cnut absorbed the true nature of kingship. He did not need to experiment. History had provided him a masterclass in conquest, rule, and survival. Svein may have ruled briefly, but through Cnut, the lessons of his reign would resonate for decades, shaping a kingdom that had learned, perhaps more profoundly than ever, how power is claimed, maintained, and remembered. Cnut understood why his father, Svein Forkbeard, had failed to secure lasting rule over England. It was not because the kingdom resisted with armies or rebellion. England had already surrendered, quietly and pragmatically, to Svein's inevitability. The people had bent, the nobles had calculated, and the crown had changed hands with minimal bloodshed. No, Svein's failure came from something less dramatic but far more decisive. Time ran out. The winter was harsh, Svein's health faltered, and months of careful consolidation were cut short by forces beyond even a king's control. Authority, so freshly claimed, proved too delicate to survive such sudden absence. Cnut observed all of this closely. He watched how obedience could be earned, how fear and perception could bend a kingdom, and how quickly the foundations of power could crumble if not solidified. He learned patience. He would not rush. He would not rely on inevitability alone. Cnut understood that conquest is more than arrival. It is preparation, presence, and endurance. He would take the time his father could not, ensuring that when he claimed England, the crown would rest not on borrowed time, but on a kingdom ready to recognize and sustain his authority. Cnut's strategy was clear. Wait, learn, and act only when every element favored permanence. With Æthelred restored, England tried to believe once more. Courts reopened and justice was administered. Taxes were collected. Borders were patrolled. On paper, the machinery of governance hummed along as it had before Svein's arrival. The structures of the kingdom remained intact, familiar, and orderly. But belief felt thinner. The sense that the crown was unassailable, that authority was absolute, had eroded. Nobles obeyed, but cautiously. Communities complied, but calculated every move. The kingdom functioned, but without the confidence that had once made obedience instinctive. Authority had become conditional, fragile, and constantly under scrutiny. Every action by the king, every decree, every punishment was measured against the memory of past failures. Æthelred's restored rule was less a triumph than a negotiation, a delicate exercise in maintaining loyalty that could be withdrawn at any moment. The crown was present, but its power was now mediated through perception and consent rather than unquestioned reverence. England moved, but it no longer moved with certainty. It existed in a state of cautious continuity, aware that authority could shift again as easily as it had shifted before. The kingdom was alive, but it had changed. Function remained. Order remained, but confidence, the unseen force that underpins true power, was harder to reclaim. Viking pressure did not vanish. It paused, not in surrender, not in retreat, but in observation. The raids slowed, the fleets lingered at the edges of sight, and the threat became a shadow hovering over England rather than a blaze consuming it. Pauses are dangerous, especially when they are mistaken for peace. A kingdom might relax, reorganize, and believe that the storm has passed. Yet the quiet is never neutral. It is a strategic space where preparation, calculation, and inevitability gather unseen. Æthelred's restored rule seemed to bring stability. Courts functioned. Taxes were collected. Borders were monitored. Life appeared to return to normal. But the pause in Viking activity was not a reprieve. It was an opportunity, measured and deliberate, watched closely by those who had learned the lessons of Svein Forkbeard's brief conquest. Every pause carries the risk of underestimation. England had seen how obedience could be temporary, how authority could be questioned, and how quickly belief could erode. In this calm, the kingdom's fragile trust was being tested again. Peace in this context was an illusion. The threat had not disappeared. It waited, silent, patient, and inevitable. And England, still learning the price of conditional authority, would feel that presence long before it became impossible to ignore. Æthelred ruled with caution, perhaps too much caution. Each decision was measured, every order carefully weighed, every action delayed by fear of misstep. The king moved as though testing the ground before stepping, consulting advisors, weighing risks, and replaying past failures in his mind. Authority, once assumed by inheritance, now required constant calculation. But hesitation is dangerous. Every moment of indecision creates space for doubt. Nobles begin to question, communities begin to calculate their own interests, and the impression of weakness spreads faster than armies. A ruler who pauses too long risks losing more than respect. He risks losing obedience entirely. England, already wary from years of conditional loyalty, observed its king closely. Orders were followed, but compliance was cautious, measured, and sometimes begrudging. Where decisive leadership might have reinforced authority, delay only confirmed suspicions that Æthelred could not command as Svein had. Hesitation invites challenge. It invites negotiation, ambition, and even rebellion. Power is not only claimed through presence or command, it is maintained through timely action. A kingdom does not respect a crown that hesitates to enforce it. Æthelred's caution, born of survival instinct and memory of failure, was meant to protect the crown. Instead, it slowly eroded the very authority it hoped to preserve, leaving England balanced precariously between obedience and opportunity. England felt tired, not desperate, not defeated, not broken, but weary. A kingdom that had weathered years of conditional authority, foreign conquest, and fractured loyalty carried a collective fatigue. Its institutions continued to function. Courts ran, taxes were collected, borders were patrolled. But beneath the surface, the people moved more cautiously, calculated more carefully, and measured each action against the lessons of recent history. This was the kind of exhaustion that makes a kingdom receptive to change. When confidence is thin and belief in authority fragile, even small gestures or subtle demonstrations of strength can tip the balance. Nobles began to consider alternatives quietly, towns observed without commitment, and communities weighed survival above loyalty. The old patterns of obedience, once reliable, now required constant reaffirmation. England's tiredness was not weakness, it was an opportunity. A kingdom weary of indecision, conditional rule, and fragile crowns becomes a place where a new vision can take root. Change does not arrive as a storm here. It arrives subtly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, riding the currents of accumulated fatigue. In this environment, authority is neither permanent nor guaranteed. It must be earned, observed, and maintained. And England, tired yet watchful, was ready to recognize whoever could meet that challenge. When Cnut finally returned to England, it felt strangely familiar. The kingdom had seen this before, an external force arriving, a crown changing hands, nobles calculating loyalties, and communities adjusting quietly to new authority. But this time, there was a difference. England had learned. It had experienced the conditional nature of kingship under Æthelred, the inevitability of Svein Forkbeard's brief rule, and the fragile balance between submission and survival. Now it understood the pattern. It understood that authority is not absolute, that loyalty can be negotiated, that obedience is never guaranteed, and most importantly, it understood that power belongs not to the crown alone, but to those who choose to recognize it. Cnut did not need to storm fortresses or enforce obedience through terror. He did not need to assert legitimacy through ceremony or tradition. England, weary from the past, was already prepared to respond. Its towns, nobles, and communities had internalized the lessons of conditional rule. They would follow a ruler who demonstrated competence, presence, and inevitability, and they would resist one who did not. In this sense, Cnut's arrival was both conquest and collaboration. The kingdom moved with him not blindly but knowingly. England had been tested, reshaped, and educated by history, and now it was ready to recognize the king who understood how to wield that knowledge. Cnut did not behave like a conqueror. There were no dramatic displays of force, no raids, no sudden imposition of power. He moved with intention, with patience, with the awareness that conquest alone does not secure a kingdom, it only opens the door. He acted like a future king. Cnut negotiated. He spoke to nobles, towns, and communities in a language they could understand, the language of stability. He promised continuity, respect for existing structures, and a recognition of the kingdom's needs. His presence reassured rather than intimidated. Where Svein had relied on inevitability and presence, Cnut relied on perception and planning, on the subtle art of guiding a kingdom to accept him willingly. In every interaction, he demonstrated foresight. He understood that England's loyalty was not a given. It had to be earned, not through fear, but through calculated confidence and clear signals that the crown would bring order, not chaos. Cnut's strategy was subtle yet powerful. By presenting himself as a stabilizing force rather than a disruptor, he aligned the kingdom with his rule before a single sword was drawn. Conquest in his hands became as much about psychology as power. England followed, not blindly but knowingly, and in that understanding lay the enduring strength of Cnut's kingship. England's nobles recalculated, again, but this time it was different. The lessons of past years had not been forgotten. Svein Forkbeard had shown that crowns could change hands with minimal bloodshed. Æthelred's cautious return had demonstrated that kingship was conditional, fragile, and constantly scrutinized. Every action, every pause, every decision could shift loyalty or fracture obedience. Now, with Cnut arriving not as a conqueror but as a future king, the nobles measured their choices more deliberately. They weighed survival against opportunity, continuity against ambition. Their calculations were precise, grounded in experience, and informed by a kingdom that had learned how quickly authority could dissolve or be claimed. Each decision carried consequence. Oaths were given, promises exchanged, and allegiances reformed, but all were made with eyes open, minds aware, and caution heightened. This was not blind obedience. It was strategic alignment. England had seen the fragility of crowns. It had witnessed the impermanence of authority. Now it acted with knowledge, patience, and a careful understanding of power. The kingdom was no longer simply reacting, it was anticipating. For Cnut, this meant that victory was not guaranteed by force alone. He would need to honor the lessons of England's careful recalculation if he wished to transform conditional loyalty into lasting authority. Æthelred died in 1016, not with a clash of swords, not amid rebellion or bloodshed. His end was quieter, less dramatic, but no less significant. It was symbolic. His reign concluded not in chaos, but in exhaustion. The kingdom, after decades of conditional loyalty, foreign incursions, and fractured authority, had reached the limit of its patience. Æthelred's struggles to govern, to restore belief in the crown, and to navigate a landscape shaped by Svein Forkbeard's conquest had left him drained, his influence diminished, and his legacy contested. The king's death marked the close of an era in which the English monarchy had been tested, negotiated, and questioned at every turn. Authority had been measured in conditional terms, obedience had been carefully observed, and loyalty had been earned rather than assumed. Æthelred's passing did not signal collapse. England remained intact, but it did signal the end of a style of kingship that had relied heavily on inherited power rather than firm command. The kingdom now faced a new reality. Power could be seized, measured, and sustained, but only by those who understood its fragility. Æthelred's death cleared the stage, leaving the crown ready for a successor who had learned the lessons of patience, strategy, and perception. England did not fall. It evolved. Æthelred's son, Edmund, tried to resist. He raised armies. He engaged in battle. He took measures to assert authority and rally loyalty in a kingdom still reeling from years of conditional obedience, foreign conquest, and fractured confidence. His efforts were real, deliberate, and brave. For a moment, it seemed as if resistance could matter, that perhaps a new generation of the old dynasty might reclaim its place. And in that, Edmund's struggle mattered. Every clash, every maneuver, every stand he took reminded England that authority could be contested, that crowns were not unbreakable, and that the memory of past kings could still inspire action. His fight held symbolic weight. It was a statement that kingship was not only about inherited titles, but also about the courage and will to act. Yet it was too late. The kingdom had already shifted. Nobles had recalculated their loyalties. Communities had adapted to survival under new expectations. The crown, though historically tied to Æthelred's line, was no longer guaranteed by blood alone. Power now required more than inheritance. It demanded perception, strategy, and inevitability, qualities that Edmund, despite his effort, could not fully command in time. The struggle mattered, but timing mattered more. History had already moved. The era of Æthelred's heirs was ending, and England was preparing to follow a new ruler who understood the lessons Svein Forkbeard had taught and Cnut would perfect. When Edmund died, England made its choice, not because Cnut was Danish, not because he carried the legacy of Svein Forkbeard, not because of his lineage or his banners. The kingdom's decision was far subtler and far more telling. England chose Cnut because he felt inevitable. It was a quiet inevitability, forged over years of observation, calculation, and preparation. The nobles had seen him learn from his father's brief rule. The towns had witnessed his careful diplomacy. Communities understood that his arrival was not sudden, not chaotic, not violent. It was measured, strategic, and almost natural. Authority, in this case, did not need to be demanded. It needed only to be recognized. Cnut's inevitability was not just perception. It was the product of patience, foresight, and mastery of the kingdom's conditional loyalties. He had studied England, its people, its rulers, and its weaknesses. He knew when to act, when to wait, and how to make obedience seem voluntary rather than forced. When Edmund fell, resistance faded with him. The crown, though once contested, no longer seemed open to negotiation. England followed not because it was compelled, but because it understood the logic of inevitability. In that recognition lay power far more durable than fear, far more enduring than tradition. Cnut did not conquer. England chose him. Cnut ruled where Svein Forkbeard could not. Not because he wielded a larger army, or because his claim was stronger, or because England had suddenly become more obedient. He ruled because the path had already been cleared. Svein had broken the barrier, the invisible line that separates temporary conquest from lasting authority. Svein had shown that England could change kings without collapsing, that loyalty could be negotiated, that crowns were not untouchable but conditional. He had exposed the fragility of inherited power, the necessity of presence, and the influence of perception. For all his brief reign, Svein had demonstrated the rules of power in a kingdom that had never fully tested them before. Cnut inherited more than a throne. He inherited understanding. He inherited a kingdom that had been educated in the art of conditional loyalty, in the subtle dynamics of fear, pragmatism, and inevitability. He knew that conquest was not just about force, but about timing, calculation, and patience. Where Svein arrived and proved what could happen, Cnut arrived and ensured it would endure. Authority became lasting, not temporary. Obedience became strategic, not forced. The crown, once fragile and contested, was now aligned with inevitability. Svein had broken the barrier. Cnut walked through it, and the kingdom followed. Cnut ruled carefully, not with the suddenness of a raider, nor with the short-term inevitability that had marked his father Svein's conquest. He ruled with intention, blending law with force, ceremony with oversight, and tradition with direct control. Authority under Cnut was both seen and understood. It was a balance between expectation and enforcement. Svein had conquered. He arrived, and his presence demanded recognition. His reign was brief but transformative, a demonstration of what could happen when a kingdom's conditional loyalty was tested. Svein proved the possibility of power, the fragility of obedience, and the inevitability that careful timing can produce. But his rule lacked permanence. It was built on immediacy, presence, and the temporary leverage of fear and uncertainty. Cnut, however, governed. He took the lessons Svein left behind and converted them into enduring authority. Where Svein relied on inevitability, Cnut relied on perception and patience. Where Svein's rule was sudden, Cnut's was deliberate. Laws were enforced consistently. Loyalties were observed, negotiated, and maintained. Garrisons, hostages, and oversight ensured compliance, while respect for tradition and ceremony secured legitimacy. Under Cnut, conquest became governance. The kingdom was no longer merely subdued, it was guided, managed, and stabilized. Svein had shown the path. Cnut walked it, ensuring that the crown's power would be sustained long after the swords were sheathed. England emerged changed. The kingdom that had once relied on unquestioned loyalty and assumed authority now carried the lessons of upheaval in every corner. It was stronger in some ways, its institutions tested, its nobles experienced, and its communities more aware of the fragility of power. England had learned how to survive conditional kingship, foreign conquest, and the subtle dynamics of authority. Yet it was also more cautious. Trust was measured, obedience scrutinized, and allegiance negotiated rather than freely given. The people, having witnessed the rise and fall of kings, understood that crowns could change hands, that loyalty could be temporary, and that power was never permanent. Every decision, every oath, every act of submission was informed by memory, calculation, and the understanding that belief, once broken, could not be fully restored. And above all, England was never innocent again. The kingdom had been tested by Svein Forkbeard, tempered by Æthelred's struggles, and refined under Cnut's careful governance. It had witnessed the impermanence of authority, the consequences of hesitation, and the weight of inevitability. In this New England, obedience was earned, authority was conditional, and survival required awareness. The land had endured, but it had changed, forever reshaped by the lessons of conquest, strategy, and the fragile power of belief. Svein Forkbeard ruled briefly. His time on the English throne was measured in weeks, not years. There were no monumental battles, no sweeping reforms, no centuries-long legacy carved into stone. On the surface, his reign might seem fleeting, almost forgettable. But history does not measure impact in weeks. It measures consequences. Svein's brief rule shattered assumptions about power, obedience, and the permanence of crowns. He demonstrated that a kingdom could surrender quietly, that nobles would negotiate loyalties, and that authority could be conditional. He revealed the fragility of inherited power and the subtle dynamics that determine whether a ruler is obeyed or ignored. The consequences of Svein's arrival rippled far beyond his short life. England had learned that kingship could be contested, that loyalty could shift, and that submission might come not from reverence but from practicality. Svein's presence changed how the kingdom viewed authority, how it measured risk, and how it calculated survival. Weeks in power can alter decades of perception. The brief reign of Svein Forkbeard was a catalyst, showing that the crown could change hands, that inevitability could shape obedience, and that the lessons of conditional loyalty could define generations. History remembered him not for his time, but for what his rule made inevitable. Svein Forkbeard's true reign began not while he lived, but after he died. His rule was brief, his presence fleeting, yet the lessons he left behind endured far longer than his time on the throne. England, a kingdom that had once taken loyalty for granted, had been forced to reckon with a new reality. Kingship was fragile. Authority could be challenged, crowns could change hands, and obedience was never guaranteed. Power depended on belief, not just bloodlines or tradition. Svein's conquest revealed that a kingdom's strength lies not only in armies or fortresses, but in the willingness of its people to accept a ruler. When that belief is shaken, even the most enduring crowns become vulnerable. His reign, though short, reshaped the very understanding of governance in England. The implications were profound. Æthelred returned to a kingdom more cautious, more calculating, and no longer willing to accept authority unquestioningly. Nobles negotiated, communities observed, and conditional loyalty became the new norm. In this sense, Svein's impact was enduring. He demonstrated that power is not simply seized, it is perceived, maintained, and reinforced through awareness and inevitability. England would never govern the same way again. His kingship, though brief, became a permanent lesson in the fragility of authority and the necessity of belief. After his death, Svein Forkbeard seemed to vanish from English memory. He had ruled for only 5 weeks. No coronation, no sweeping campaigns, no legendary battles to fill the annals of history. Yet the shadow of his presence lingered, subtle, unseen, but undeniably transformative. History often remembers conquerors for their duration or the drama of their deeds. Svein had neither. His triumph was quieter, structural. He exposed the weaknesses within England's system of governance, revealing that kingship was far more fragile than tradition suggested. He showed that authority relied on belief, that loyalty could not be assumed, only maintained, that fear and gold might temporarily replace law, but they could never create permanence. Svein demonstrated that a crown without recognition is an empty symbol, and a kingdom without conviction is vulnerable. In this way, Svein became a ghost of inevitability, a ruler whose significance is measured not in feats or duration, but in consequences. England's nobles, communities, and rulers would carry the lessons he imparted, consciously or unconsciously, shaping decisions for decades. Though brief, his reign left a permanent mark, a reminder that authority is earned, belief is power, and even the shortest rule can reshape a kingdom forever. With Svein gone and Æthelred temporarily restored, England stood at a crossroads. Return to old ways, or adapt to the lessons learned from conquest and collapse. The answer was neither simple nor complete. Instead, the kingdom embraced an uneasy compromise. Nobles retained more independence than before, carefully balancing obedience with self-interest. Regional power grew in significance, as local leaders learned that survival sometimes depended on acting with discretion rather than blind loyalty. The monarchy, for its part, discovered that authority could no longer be assumed. Orders had to be observed, promises honored, and trust constantly reinforced. Svein's shadow lingered over every decision. His brief reign had exposed the fragile foundations beneath the crown, the conditional nature of obedience, and the subtle dynamics that determine whether a king is respected or ignored. England could no longer rely on tradition alone. Loyalty was no longer automatic. It had to be earned, maintained, and observed. The kingdom emerged altered. It was stronger in awareness, more cautious in action, and acutely conscious of the limits of power. Conquest had taught a quiet lesson. Authority is never guaranteed, belief is never permanent, and a crown, no matter how ancient, must continually prove its legitimacy. In the wake of Svein Forkbeard, England had learned that survival demanded vigilance as much as obedience. Even without holding power for long, Svein Forkbeard achieved a conquest that went beyond armies and crowns. He claimed something far subtler, the kingdom's psychology. England learned that authority was not permanent. It discovered that a king could be replaced, that obedience was conditional, and that the crown's power rested on belief as much as law. Æthelred came to understand the fragility of his position, recognizing that his reign could be challenged not only by force, but by perception and circumstance. The lessons Svein left behind were not lost on the next generation. Cnut, his son, would later return to England with patience, strategy, and an understanding of what was at stake, lessons distilled from his father's brief, yet transformative experience. Svein's impact was measured not in battles fought or years ruled, but in the awareness he planted. That power depends on recognition, that loyalty is negotiable, and that authority must be maintained through presence, strategy, and inevitability. Sometimes history's most consequential victories are invisible. They leave no monuments, no grand tales of heroism, no enduring armies. Yet their effects ripple through generations, reshaping kingdoms and recalibrating the rules of power. Svein's reign lasted only weeks. Its influence lasted generations. The crown had changed, and so had England. Across the North Sea, Svein Forkbeard's brief successes left a lasting imprint on the ambitions of his people. Cnut grew up with a blueprint in hand, not a guide of triumphs, but a map of lessons learned. He watched England closely, noting its failures, hesitations, and the fragile structures Svein had tested. The kingdom's weaknesses became his education. Svein's mistakes were not forgotten. They became cautionary lessons, shaping the strategies Cnut would later employ. At the same time, Svein's accomplishments, though fleeting, offered proof of what was possible. A crown could change hands. A kingdom could be influenced without protracted war. Loyalties could shift, and authority could be tested. These realizations, once abstract, now became concrete examples for the next generation. Cnut internalized both sides of his father's legacy, the triumphs that demonstrated opportunity and the failures that exposed limits. Together, they formed a guide to power in England, a combination of patience, calculation, and inevitability that Svein himself had only glimpsed. In this way, Svein's reign transcended its brief duration. His impact was not measured in weeks, but in the strategies it inspired, the lessons it taught, and the preparation it enabled. England had changed once, and through Cnut, Svein's influence would shape it again. England's nobles, who had long been divided by rivalries and ambitions, suddenly grasped a deeper truth about allegiance. They understood that inaction could be deadly. Support for a king was no longer automatic, it was conditional. Every decision carried weight, every choice could tilt the balance of power, and hesitation could mean ruin. Loyalties were no longer a matter of tradition or inherited duty. They were calculated, measured, and constantly reevaluated against the shifting landscape of authority. Svein Forkbeard's brief presence on English soil had left an indelible lesson. His conquest, though short, demonstrated that compliance often offered the safest path, at least temporarily. Defiance could invite consequences that were swift and unforgiving, and waiting to act could leave one vulnerable when the tides of power shifted unexpectedly. The nobles learned that survival depended on awareness. Observation became as important as loyalty. Decisions were no longer made blindly or purely from principle. They were informed by the memory of Svein's inevitability, by the awareness that crowns could change hands without warning, and by the understanding that authority was fragile and fluid. In this recalculated environment, obedience became strategic, not automatic. Compliance was a tool, not a virtue. And England, for the first time, was learning to navigate the subtle currents of power with caution, calculation, and an acute sense of consequence. Svein Forkbeard's death left a void in England, a kingdom suddenly without a clear master, a crown momentarily unclaimed. Into that vacuum stepped his son, Cnut. He did not arrive with haste or with the impulsiveness that had marked his father's brief reign. Instead, he brought strategy, patience, and an acute understanding of the lessons Svein had left behind. Cnut inherited more than ambition. He inherited insight. He saw where Svein had succeeded and just as importantly, where he had faltered. He understood that a crown seized too quickly could crumble, that authority imposed without preparation could be temporary, and that the perception of inevitability was as powerful as any army. Unlike Svein, Cnut would not rely solely on presence or fear. He would plan, observe, and wait. Every movement, every decision, and every negotiation would be calculated to maximize obedience and minimize resistance. Timing would be his ally, patience his tool. In doing so, Cnut transformed ambition into strategy. He learned from his father's brief but influential rule, ensuring that when he finally acted, success would be deliberate, overwhelming, and lasting. Svein had broken the barrier, but Cnut would walk through it with preparation, turning fleeting conquest into enduring authority. England appeared stable. Markets operated, taxes were collected, and daily life went on as usual. On the surface, the kingdom seemed unshaken, orderly, and secure. But beneath this calm, tension simmered quietly. Communities, nobles, and ordinary townspeople all carried a new awareness. Crowns could be contested, kings could fail, and loyalty was no longer automatic. Authority, once assumed, now demanded continual reinforcement. The lessons of recent decades had left their mark, teaching that obedience was conditional, that political calculations mattered more than tradition, and that power was as much about perception as it was about force. Every decision, every act of governance, unfolded within this fragile equilibrium. Nobles watched one another and the crown, measuring threats and opportunities. Local leaders negotiated, withheld, or extended support depending on circumstance. Ordinary people adapted, surviving within a system where allegiance was strategic rather than instinctive. This was England after Svein Forkbeard and Æthelred's turbulent reigns, a kingdom outwardly stable, yet internally vigilant. The crown remained, the institutions endured, but the underlying currents of caution, calculation, and conditional loyalty defined the era. Stability was no longer guaranteed. It was maintained, delicate and carefully observed, shaping the kingdom's politics, society, and future. In this quiet tension, the stage was set for those who could understand power, patience, and inevitability. Æthelred's temporary restoration highlighted a hard truth. Governance without trust is fragile. Attempts at reform were made, but the shadow of past failures lingered. Nobles remained wary, communities watched cautiously, and ordinary people measured every decree against the lessons of recent upheavals. Decisions that once might have been swift were now delayed, debated, and second-guessed. Punishments, once predictable, became uneven, further eroding confidence in royal authority. The kingdom operated, but it was a brittle operation. Stability existed only in appearance, held together by fragile expectations and cautious compliance. Æthelred ruled, but his authority had been conditioned by the memory of conquest, betrayal, and uncertainty. Svein Forkbeard's brief reign, though lasting mere weeks, had left an indelible mark. He revealed that power without legitimacy is temporary, that obedience without belief is fragile, and that crowns alone do not guarantee loyalty. His presence forced England to confront the practical realities of governance in a way no previous conflict had. In essence, Svein's fleeting rule became a lesson in administration, trust, and the nature of authority. England learned, the hard way, that competent, respected governance requires more than inherited titles or ceremonial crowns. It requires belief, consistency, and the understanding that power is only as strong as the confidence it inspires. Beyond England, Svein Forkbeard's brief rule sent ripples across Europe. Other kingdoms took careful notice. The Vikings, long seen as marauders and raiders, were now recognized as potential rulers, forces capable of not just plunder, but of claiming crowns and reshaping kingdoms. Svein's achievement challenged traditional assumptions about power, demonstrating that authority could be seized not only through battle, but through timing, perception, and the fragility of belief. Diplomats and rulers in France, Norway, and the Holy Roman Empire watched closely. They noted how swiftly England had faltered, not because of overwhelming force, but because faith in the crown had eroded. The collapse of belief, they realized, was as decisive as any army, as lethal as any weapon. Svein had shown that loyalty could be negotiated, obedience could be tested, and even the most established kingdoms could be unsettled when confidence faltered. Svein's reign, though brief, reframed the European understanding of power. Kings and envoys alike began to reassess their strategies, factoring in the invisible yet crucial dynamics of perception, timing, and conditional allegiance. What once seemed impossible, a foreign ruler claiming an English crown, now appeared plausible. In this sense, Svein Forkbeard's influence extended far beyond his weeks on the throne. He reshaped not only England but the political imagination of Europe, redefining what ambition, opportunity, and strategy could achieve. Svein Forkbeard demonstrated a profound truth: power is often perception. Æthelred remained king in name, his crown intact, his title undisputed, but in practice his authority was hollow. Decisions were questioned, orders hesitated over, and loyalty was conditional. In contrast, Svein, though reigning for only a matter of weeks, commanded influence. His presence, timing, and strategic advantage made him king in effect. People obeyed, communities submitted, and authority flowed toward him, not because of tradition, ceremony, or inheritance, but because he embodied inevitability. This subtle but crucial distinction transformed the understanding of rulership. Authority was no longer simply a matter of bloodlines, fortresses, or armies. It depended on perception, on belief, and on the sense that resistance was futile. Physical control remained important, but the illusion of inevitability could achieve what force alone could not. Svein's fleeting reign revealed that legitimacy can be manufactured through presence, timing, and strategic pressure. Kings learned that to govern effectively, they must inspire confidence as much as enforce obedience. Obedience is rarely granted purely for titles. It is earned through perception, calculated action, and the careful demonstration of power's inevitability. In this way, Svein's brief rule reshaped not only England but the very principles of authority, showing that sometimes the crown is strongest in the mind, long after the sword has been sheathed. England now existed under a quiet tension. Life carried on, markets opened, taxes were collected, and orders were technically obeyed. But beneath the surface, trust in the crown had become fragile. Every new edict was measured, every tax scrutinized, every call to arms tested the loyalty of nobles and communities alike. Authority was no longer automatic. It had to be earned, reaffirmed, and constantly observed. Svein Forkbeard's brief presence had left a permanent mark, a subtle but undeniable edge in the kingdom's consciousness. He had shown that change could arrive suddenly, that crowns could shift hands, and that obedience could be conditional. His short reign was a reminder that stability is never guaranteed, and that even long-standing institutions can be challenged if belief falters. As a result, England operated with caution, awareness, and a constant undercurrent of calculation. Nobles weighed their choices carefully, communities observed developments before committing support, and the monarchy had to navigate a world where authority was provisional rather than absolute. Svein's conquest, though fleeting, had reshaped expectations and behavior. The kingdom had adapted to a new reality. Power could change abruptly, loyalty was negotiable, and survival depended on understanding the delicate balance between authority and perception. England was functioning, but it was functioning with eyes wide open. In popular memory, Svein Forkbeard nearly vanished. Not because his conquest failed, quite the opposite. His triumph was subtle, measured, and fleeting. He ruled for only a few weeks. There were no legendary battles, no sweeping campaigns, no dramatic coronations to fill chronicles or inspire ballads. His victory was structural, quiet, and strategic. Yet the absence of spectacle did not diminish its impact. The consequences of Svein's brief reign echoed far beyond the weeks he spent in power. England's monarchy, once regarded as unassailable, learned that crowns alone did not command obedience. Loyalty was not automatic, authority was conditional, and belief could be shaken as easily as it could be granted. Svein's success lay not in the duration of his rule, but in the transformation he forced upon the kingdom. He revealed the fragility underlying centuries of tradition, showed that political allegiance could shift, and demonstrated that perception often outweighs force. Though time has largely obscured his name, the lessons he left behind endured. England would never again assume unquestioned loyalty. Kings would have to earn it, maintain it, and defend it, not just with armies, but with strategy, presence, and the understanding that authority is always as much a matter of belief as of blood. Svein's shadow, invisible yet enduring, reshaped the kingdom forever. Cnut approached England with the patience of a student and the calculation of a strategist. He studied the kingdom carefully, observing not just its wealth or armies, but its underlying structures, its loyalties, and its weaknesses. He saw how authority depended on belief, how compliance could be won or lost, and how perception could outweigh sheer force. Svein Forkbeard's brief reign had left both lessons and warnings. The fleeting victories, the mistakes, and the fragile hold of a crown taken too quickly. From this, Cnut built a roadmap. Svein's temporary success proved that conquest was possible, but his failures showed that lasting rule required more than presence or momentum. Authority had to be reinforced, legitimacy had to be recognized, and loyalty had to be earned before action was taken. Cnut's approach was patient, deliberate, and methodical. Every move would be calculated, every engagement measured, and every opportunity seized at the right moment. He would not rush as his father had, nor rely solely on fear or spectacle. Instead, he would combine strategy with preparation, force with diplomacy, and timing with inevitability. In this way, Svein's legacy became a guide for success. His reign, though brief, shaped the approach of the next generation. Cnut would not repeat history by mistake. He would master it, ensuring that the crown he pursued would be more than a symbol. It would be permanent. Æthelred sought to reclaim his authority, but the path was fraught with invisible obstacles. He repaired towns, strengthened fortifications, and attempted measures of fair governance, hoping to restore confidence in the crown. Administrators worked to enforce laws consistently, and efforts were made to rebuild the fragile trust between the monarchy and the people. Yet despite these efforts, England remained wary. Communities, nobles, and officials all carried the memory of recent instability. Loyalty was no longer assumed. It was constantly tested, observed, and negotiated. The presence of Svein Forkbeard, though long gone, continued to shape the kingdom. His shadow was invisible, yet persistent. It reminded every observer that authority could be challenged, that crowns were conditional, and that obedience could shift suddenly. Even as Æthelred issued decrees and reconstructed towns, the memory of Svein's brief but consequential reign lingered in the background, influencing decisions, alliances, and perceptions of power. In this environment, recovery was never complete. Stability could be restored outwardly, but confidence remained fragile. Every success was measured against the lessons of Svein's arrival, his strategic timing, and the ease with which he had exploited England's vulnerabilities. Æthelred ruled, but he ruled cautiously, aware that the kingdom had learned an enduring truth. Power is as much about perception as it is about authority, and Svein's mark would never fully fade. Even after his departure, Svein Forkbeard's brief conquest left a lasting mark, not through armies or laws, but through the subtle power of fear. England had learned that change could arrive swiftly and without warning. The crown was no longer a guarantee. Authority was conditional, and loyalty could shift in an instant. This fear was multifaceted. It was the fear of sudden upheaval, that a new power could emerge without ceremony or warning. It was the fear of betrayal, that trusted nobles or allies might act in their own interest when the crown appeared weak. And it was the fear of being unprepared, that the structures of governance, long assumed secure, could fail at the most critical moment. These psychological tremors were profound. They affected not only kings and nobles, but the behavior of entire communities. Decisions were measured more carefully, allegiances more cautiously pledged, and caution became the default mode of governance. Obedience was no longer assumed. It had to be earned, maintained, and constantly observed. Svein's impact, though brief in duration, shaped the kingdom's consciousness for decades. It created a heightened awareness of vulnerability, a permanent edge in political calculation, and a recognition that power rested as much in perception as in reality. In this way, fear became one of Svein's most enduring legacies. Time is often the ultimate arbiter in history, revealing truths that immediate events cannot. Svein Forkbeard did not have the weeks or the months needed to fully consolidate his rule over England. He did not establish lasting institutions, build deep alliances, or leave behind a fully structured administration. And yet, in the brief span of his presence, time itself exposed the kingdom's vulnerabilities. England's fragile loyalties, conditional obedience, and reliance on perception, rather than enforcement, became painfully clear. His reign, short as it was, functioned as a lens, highlighting the weaknesses that centuries of tradition and ceremonial authority had failed to address. Nobles, communities, and even the crown itself were forced to confront the reality that obedience could shift, authority could erode, and a kingdom could be unsettled not just by force, but by timing, calculation, and perception. Sometimes history's most consequential figures are not those who rule longest or achieve legendary feats. They are the catalytic ones, those whose actions, however brief, accelerate change, expose fragility, and reshape the course of events. Svein Forkbeard exemplifies this truth, a ruler measured not by duration, but by the enduring consequences his fleeting presence set in motion. His weeks on the throne may have been short, but their reverberations shaped England for generations to come. By witnessing Svein Forkbeard's brief rule and observing its impact on themselves, England absorbed lessons that would shape its politics and society for generations. First, authority requires trust. Æthelred's crown, though intact in name, had lost the automatic obedience it once commanded. Svein's arrival revealed that power depends as much on belief and legitimacy as on armies or titles. Without trust, even the most established monarch is vulnerable. Second, loyalty is conditional. Nobles, communities, and officials realized that allegiance could shift quickly when confidence in leadership faltered. Obedience is not guaranteed. It must be maintained through action, consistency, and perception. England learned to navigate this delicate balance, understanding that decisions, promises, and presence all influence loyalty. Finally, conquest is possible without prolonged warfare. Svein's strategy relied not on endless battles, but on timing, perception, and exploiting existing fragilities. He demonstrated that the appearance of inevitability can achieve what brute force alone cannot. These lessons were internalized by England's rulers, informing policy, alliances, and governance in the decades that followed. Kings and nobles recalculated their strategies, knowing that authority could not be assumed, loyalty could shift, and kingdoms could be unsettled in ways that were invisible yet decisive. Svein's reign was short, but its lessons endured, reshaping English political thought and leaving a blueprint for both caution and ambition. Cnut inherited more than a claim to the English crown. He inherited a set of lessons forged in his father Svein's brief and consequential reign. He observed the kingdom carefully, learning where authority had faltered, where trust had eroded, and how perception could shape outcomes as much as armies. Svein's short rule became both a warning and a guide. It demonstrated the fragility of loyalty, the importance of legitimacy, and the power of timing and strategic pressure. Armed with this knowledge, Cnut approached England differently. He would act decisively but deliberately, blending force with diplomacy, presence with preparation. Unlike Svein, he would not rely solely on fear or speed. He would reinforce his authority through careful planning, alliances, and the cultivation of trust. Every engagement, every negotiation, and every demonstration of power would be measured, ensuring that obedience was not temporary but enduring. Svein's ghost lingered over England, not as a ruler but as a blueprint. It reminded Cnut of what worked, what failed, and what could be transformed into lasting control. In this way, the lessons of a fleeting reign shaped the strategy of the next generation. Where Svein had conquered briefly, Cnut would govern with permanence, turning observation into action, insight into authority, and inherited ambition into decisive, enduring rule. England's transformation was subtle, almost imperceptible to contemporaries. No sweeping battles, no heroic last stands, no legendary exploits marked the change. Chronicles of the time scarcely note it. Yet beneath the surface, the kingdom's structure had shifted in ways both profound and enduring. Authority no longer rested solely on tradition, ritual, or inheritance. Trust had become a currency, loyalty conditional, and the perception of inevitability a source of real power. Svein Forkbeard's brief reign, though lasting only weeks, acted as a catalyst. His presence revealed vulnerabilities that had long been overlooked. The fragility of obedience, the dependence of kingship on belief, and the susceptibility of even a storied monarchy to strategic disruption. Nobles, officials, and communities internalized these lessons, adjusting their behavior in subtle ways, measuring allegiance, calculating risk, and observing authority more carefully than ever before. These ripples spread quietly but persistently through English governance, society, and culture. Decisions were scrutinized, alliances more carefully weighed, and the crown itself became an object of conditional respect rather than automatic reverence. In the end, Svein's impact was not measured by conquests won or lost, nor by duration or ceremony, but by the invisible forces he set in motion. England had changed, not in spectacle but in substance, and those changes would echo across generations, reshaping the kingdom's very understanding of power, loyalty, and rule. By the close of Svein Forkbeard's brief reign and Æthelred's cautious return, one truth becomes undeniable. Power is fragile, and authority is never permanent. Legitimacy cannot be assumed. It must be earned, reinforced, and continually observed. Even the most established kingdoms with their armies, wealth, and traditions can bend, or even falter, under the pressures of perception, fear, and the right timing. Svein's conquest did not rely on prolonged campaigns or legendary battles. Instead, it exploited the subtleties of belief, loyalty, and inevitability, revealing weaknesses that had been overlooked for generations. Æthelred's temporary restoration underscored the lesson. Crowns do not guarantee obedience. Policies, edicts, and reforms cannot fully replace trust once it has been fractured. Authority, once tested and found lacking, must be rebuilt carefully and deliberately, or it will remain precarious. Svein Forkbeard ruled England for barely 5 weeks. Yet the brevity of his tenure only emphasizes the potency of his impact. He reshaped the way rulers, nobles, and even entire populations understood power. His presence, though fleeting, left structural consequences that guided policies, strategies, and ambitions long after his death. In this way, Svein's legacy endured, not in the battles he fought, but in the lessons he forced England to confront. That kingship is conditional, authority is fragile, and history often measures influence by consequence, not duration. After Svein's death, England seemed to breathe again. Markets opened. Farmers returned to their fields. Taxes were collected. But underneath this calm, tension lingered. The kingdom had learned a bitter lesson. Power could vanish overnight. The nobility observed, measuring every decision. Local leaders retained more independence than before, quietly asserting authority where the king could not. Citizens watched closely, aware that rulers were no longer infallible. This fragile calm defined the era. England was functioning, but it was aware of its vulnerability. The kingdom had become a place of calculated obedience, not unquestioned loyalty. Every official, every noble, understood that a misstep could cost them more than money. It could cost their lives or their lands. Svein's brief presence had instilled caution, and that lesson would echo far beyond his short reign. Æthelred returned, but he was not the same king. His authority had been tested and found fragile. Every decision was debated, every edict measured against prior failures. He attempted reforms to restore trust, but the memory of previous missteps lingered. Nobles were hesitant. Advisors whispered their caution. Local lords acted independently when convenient. Æthelred ruled, but he ruled under observation. His every move could shift the balance of loyalty, and any misstep risked undermining the crown entirely. This environment created a king who could govern only with extreme caution, a king who understood that authority without belief is a house built on sand. Svein's impact was less about conquest and more about demonstration. He had shown that England's system could crumble under pressure. Fear and conditional loyalty could substitute for force, but only temporarily. Æthelred's return demonstrated the limits of this approach. Power restored without full legitimacy could not achieve lasting stability. Even absent from the throne, Svein's influence persisted. He had altered perceptions. Kings could fall, loyalty could shift, and conquest did not require long campaigns if the target's internal cohesion was weak. This was the invisible victory, a legacy measured not in battles won, but in the reordering of expectations and belief. Across the North Sea, Cnut was watching. He saw how England functioned under Æthelred's cautious restoration, and how Svein's brief conquest had reshaped perception. He understood the vulnerabilities, the conditional loyalties, and the fragility of belief. Cnut did not rush. He studied logistics, alliances, and timing. He observed who controlled resources, who could be persuaded, and where resistance was strongest. Svein had created both opportunity and caution. Cnut's patience would allow him to act decisively when the conditions were right, learning from both his father's accomplishments and limitations. England's nobility had grown accustomed to conditional loyalty. Alliances were fragile, constantly shifting based on perception and necessity. Nobles calculated their positions carefully, aware that siding with the wrong king could have devastating consequences. Svein's brief conquest had left them skeptical of absolute power. These nobles had learned to hedge their bets, keeping options open. Some acted out of fear, some out of opportunity, and some out of sheer survival instinct. England had become a kingdom of cautious actors, each movement measured, each word analyzed, each allegiance carefully considered. The monarchy's authority was no longer inherent. It was negotiated daily, in subtle decisions and whispered counsel. Svein's conquest, brief as it was, had financial consequences. England's treasury had been stretched thin by repeated payments, or Danegeld, to avoid raids. Even after Æthelred's return, the economic strain lingered. Taxes were higher, resources scarcer, and every silver coin spent was a reminder of vulnerability. The kingdom learned an important lesson. Wealth alone could not guarantee security. Political stability required both economic management and belief in authority. Svein had exposed the fragility of relying on temporary payments instead of strong governance, leaving England wary of further external threats. Svein's impact was as psychological as it was political. He never needed to fight for long to destabilize England. The mere presence of a capable, organized adversary forced Æthelred and his nobles into defensive postures. England's people learned that fear could be weaponized more effectively than armies. The understanding that authority could be undermined without a battle changed the kingdom forever. This psychological dimension would inform Cnut's approach, showing that conquest was as much about perception as power. Svein's brief rule illustrated that timing, patience, and the exploitation of internal weaknesses could achieve results far beyond the reach of raw force. Æthelred's second rule highlighted the consequences of conditional authority. He ruled cautiously, attempting reforms, but skepticism remained. Nobles and citizens alike understood that crowns could fail, kings could flee, and loyalty was negotiable. Æthelred's legacy was not heroic, it was instructive. His reign illustrated the delicate balance of governance, the fragility of perception, and the limits of inherited authority. Svein's conquest set the stage for Cnut's eventual arrival. England was weakened not by defeat but by internal fragility. Loyalties had been tested, perception of power altered, and the monarchy shown to be negotiable. Cnut could now act with strategic advantage, observing carefully where to push, where to negotiate, and where to consolidate. Svein's brief reign created the conditions for a lasting Anglo-Scandinavian kingdom. The kingdom itself was in flux. Nobles calculated every move, townspeople adapted to uncertainty, and the monarchy operated under constant scrutiny. England's political structure had changed forever. Even after Svein's death, his brief reign had created permanent awareness that power was conditional and that kings could fail. Across the North Sea, Scandinavia watched closely. Svein's actions had proven that England was vulnerable. Ambitions grew, alliances were reconsidered, and young leaders like Cnut learned from both the successes and failures of his father. The brief occupation had demonstrated that conquest could be achieved with patience, observation, and leverage over fragile systems. Æthelred and England had no choice but to accept the new reality. They functioned under the awareness of past vulnerability. Subtle negotiations, careful reforms, and heightened caution defined governance. Even stability now came with wariness. Svein's impact was structural. He had altered the psychological, political, and economic landscape of England. Svein taught England that loyalty is conditional. He did not destroy the kingdom with force alone. He demonstrated that belief and perception shape obedience. Æthelred's cautious rule highlighted the fragility of authority, while Cnut's future strategies would capitalize on the lessons Svein left behind. The principle was clear: power is earned, maintained, and constantly observed. The most remarkable aspect of Svein's rule was its invisibility. He conquered without prolonged battles. He destabilized without destroying. His reign was brief, yet it left a permanent imprint. England had been fundamentally altered, not through violence alone, but through demonstration, perception, and the careful exploitation of internal weaknesses. Svein's actions set a precedent. England could be influenced, reshaped, and temporarily ruled without a single extended campaign. This precedent would guide Cnut, influence nobles' behavior, and reshape Scandinavian approaches to conquest. The psychological and political effects far outlasted the few weeks Svein spent on English soil. England, conditioned by Svein's rule, would now watch Cnut's approach carefully. Nobles remembered what had happened, citizens whispered rumors, and the monarchy understood that perception would again define obedience. Svein's ghost lingered in every decision, shaping the political landscape even after his death. Svein's reign highlighted the fragility of kingship. Authority without belief is unstable. Force without legitimacy is temporary. England's monarchy, long considered inviolable, had been shown to be negotiable and conditional. The kingdom's structures would never be the same. Svein's brief conquest made future invasions predictable. Cnut would not act rashly. England, however, could not forget. Every council meeting, every dispatch, every patrol was now colored by awareness that power could shift quickly and rulers could fall. Svein Forkbeard's true victory was lasting awareness. England had learned that kingship is fragile, loyalty conditional, and power perception-based. Æthelred's cautious rule and Cnut's future strategy were both shaped by the precedent he set. Even in absence, Svein's impact endured. 5 weeks. That was all Svein spent in England. Yet history remembers consequences, not duration. He destabilized a kingdom, taught lessons in power, and set the stage for future rulers. His reign may have been brief, but its impact stretched across decades, influencing kings, nobles, and citizens alike. The invisible victory of Svein Forkbeard would shape England long after he was gone. By 1015, Cnut had crossed the North Sea. Unlike his father, his approach was calculated and deliberate. Svein's brief conquest had revealed the weaknesses in England's political structure, and Cnut intended to exploit them with precision. He did not come as a raider seeking loot. He came as a ruler in waiting, understanding that perception and loyalty were as crucial as military strength. England, conditioned by Svein's actions, watched him carefully. Every step was measured, every landing observed. Towns braced, nobles debated allegiance, and the monarchy understood that this was not merely another raid, it was a potential transfer of power. England was no longer a unified kingdom. Svein's brief occupation had fractured trust. Nobles were hesitant. Some had benefited from Æthelred's cautious restoration. Others remembered the cost of defiance. Alliances were conditional and constantly shifting. Each noble weighed options: resist, submit, or negotiate. Cnut understood this dynamic and used it to his advantage. He offered calculated assurances to some, subtle threats to others. England was being ruled before Cnut even claimed a throne, through strategy and psychological insight. Cnut's brilliance lay in patience. Unlike Svein, who had acted swiftly but briefly, Cnut allowed his presence to shape perception. He avoided premature assaults, understanding that time itself could erode resistance. England, still recovering from the fear Svein instilled, began to fracture internally. Nobles tested loyalties. Towns adjusted defenses. Citizens whispered rumors. All of this played into Cnut's hands. He had learned that authority is not seized with swords alone, but with observation, timing, and subtle pressure. Cnut's early movements focused on consolidating allies quietly. Rather than overt displays of force, he rewarded loyalty and punished hesitation selectively. Nobles who swore allegiance received assurances and material incentives. Those who resisted were isolated, observed, and subtly pressured. England had become a chessboard, each piece moved with precision. Svein had shown that the kingdom was pliable. Cnut demonstrated how pliability could be converted into control. Though Cnut relied on diplomacy and perception, military action was inevitable. Skirmishes were targeted, not destructive. They served to remind England that power could be applied swiftly if negotiation failed. This measured approach kept the kingdom pliable while avoiding the destruction that had often hardened resistance in prior invasions. Svein's brief, uncontrolled conquest had left England fearful. Cnut's controlled military engagements reinforced his authority while maintaining the fragile support of the nobility. Religion became a tool for authority. Cnut ensured that church leaders were aligned with his objectives, offering protection and privileges to those who publicly supported him. England, deeply influenced by Christian structures, viewed the church as a stabilizing force. Svein had not had time to exploit these dynamics. Cnut used them masterfully. Aligning with the church provided legitimacy and bolstered perception, demonstrating that rule could be lawful and righteous, not merely imposed by fear. England's geography and fragmented nobility made full conquest difficult. Cnut exploited these divisions. The north, familiar with Scandinavian influence, was easier to secure. The south required negotiation and strategic shows of power. Each region received a tailored approach. Svein had acted indiscriminately. Cnut acted strategically, recognizing that subtlety could achieve long-term control far more effectively than brute force. Cnut inherited Svein's psychological advantage. England's citizens and nobles remembered the fleeting but impactful reign of Svein Forkbeard. Fear, caution, and the memory of conditional loyalty made the kingdom malleable. Cnut reinforced this perception, not through violence alone, but through demonstration of discipline, strategy, and timing. The knowledge that the king could be replaced and that loyalty was conditional created a mental landscape ripe for compliance. By 1016, Æthelred's authority had waned completely. Cnut's strategic patience, alliances, and psychological control left Æthelred isolated. His court weakened, and support evaporated as nobles pledged allegiance to the approaching Danish leader. England's monarchy, once thought inviolable, was now dependent on perception and negotiation. Æthelred fled, leaving a vacuum that Cnut would fill decisively. The groundwork Svein had laid decades earlier made this transition smoother than it would have been otherwise. Edmund, Æthelred's son, attempted to resist Cnut's advance. His forces engaged in localized battles, demonstrating courage and temporary defiance. However, England had already been conditioned by Svein's brief occupation and Cnut's strategic methods. Loyalties were fractured, perception was on Cnut's side, and resistance could not consolidate effectively. Edmund's struggles were brave but ultimately insufficient to alter the course of history. Recognizing the futility of prolonged resistance, Edmund agreed to a negotiated peace with Cnut. England was divided temporarily. Edmund retained Wessex while Cnut ruled the rest. This agreement prevented total bloodshed and allowed the kingdom to stabilize while Cnut consolidated power. Svein's influence remained, visible in the willingness of England to negotiate rather than fight outright. The psychological legacy of brief but impactful conquest enabled Cnut to achieve what Svein could not: lasting authority. Cnut began consolidating his rule over northern and eastern England. He secured key towns, reinforced alliances with influential nobles, and established garrisons in strategic locations. Svein had revealed the kingdom's vulnerabilities. Cnut acted decisively to fortify them. Stability was not achieved overnight, but perception of control grew steadily as Cnut's presence became visible and effective. Cnut understood that lasting rule required cooperation, not mere submission. Local leaders were incorporated into governance, offered positions, and allowed a degree of autonomy. This strategy built legitimacy, reduced resentment, and turned potential adversaries into allies. Svein had ruled briefly with fear. Cnut ruled with calculated inclusion, combining force, diplomacy, and perception to achieve enduring power. Through careful negotiation, selective force, and political acumen, Cnut established an Anglo-Danish kingdom. Svein's brief conquest had set the stage by destabilizing England and showing what was possible. Cnut expanded on this, ensuring integration of Scandinavian influence while maintaining local governance structures. The kingdom now operated under a blend of English traditions and Danish authority, creating a new political reality. The church remained a key pillar of stability. Cnut aligned with bishops and abbots, reinforcing legitimacy through religious authority. Clerics promoted the narrative that his rule was just and divinely sanctioned. Svein had not engaged with this system. Cnut leveraged it, understanding that perception and faith could stabilize authority as effectively as armies. Small pockets of resistance remained, but Cnut dealt with them decisively yet selectively. Punishment was visible but controlled, demonstrating power without widespread devastation. Svein's reign had shown England what could happen without order. Cnut ensured that dissent was contained efficiently, balancing fear and legitimacy to maintain stability. Cnut rebuilt England's economy, replenishing the treasury drained by prior Danegeld payments and instability. Trade routes were secured, towns encouraged to resume commerce, and taxation was restructured to avoid excessive burden. Svein's brief occupation had stressed the kingdom, but Cnut turned this vulnerability into an opportunity, demonstrating that strong governance and perception could restore both wealth and confidence. Though brief, Svein's conquest shaped Cnut's strategy and England's future. It revealed vulnerabilities, instilled fear, and demonstrated the importance of perception. Cnut built on this foundation to create a lasting Anglo-Danish kingdom. Svein's role was catalytic. He destabilized, Cnut consolidated. History often overlooks short reigns, but Svein's impact endured, shaping kings, nobles, and governance structures for decades. By 1020, England was transformed. Its monarchy operated under new principles of loyalty, perception, and governance. Nobles and citizens alike had learned the fragility of authority. Svein's brief occupation had taught lessons that persisted. Kings must earn belief, loyalty is conditional, and the appearance of inevitability can be as powerful as armies. Cnut's rule consolidated these lessons into lasting institutions, blending Scandinavian authority with English traditions. The events of 1014, though seemingly brief and minor, had long-term consequences. Svein Forkbeard ruled England for a few weeks, but his influence stretched far beyond that. He exposed systemic weaknesses, reshaped perception, and set the stage for a successful Danish dynasty. Authority, once thought inherent, was revealed to be conditional, fragile, and dependent on both perception and strategy. History measures not the duration of reigns but their consequences. In this sense, Svein's brief presence changed England forever. Æthelred's dynasty was effectively ended. After Æthelred's death and Edmund Ironside's defeat, England accepted Cnut as its new king. Svein's brief occupation had prepared the kingdom for this transition by demonstrating that kingship was conditional. Æthelred's failures, Svein's temporary rule, and Cnut's calculated strategy created a sequence that made the Danish takeover appear inevitable. England's monarchy, once assumed permanent, had been tested, reshaped, and replaced. This shift marked the end of the old Anglo-Saxon dominance and the beginning of a blended Anglo-Danish era. Cnut solidified his authority through diplomacy, strategic marriages, and military presence. He rewarded loyalty and ensured those who resisted were neutralized. The lessons of Svein guided him. He balanced fear with legitimacy. By 1021, most of England recognized Cnut as king. His reign was marked by careful integration of English law with Scandinavian customs. Svein's short rule had proven conquest possible, but Cnut's patience made it lasting. England under Cnut became a hybrid kingdom. Scandinavian and English customs coexisted. Trade increased with the North Sea. Governance combined local authority with centralized oversight, and loyalty was now as much negotiated as enforced. Svein's brief occupation had weakened assumptions about monarchical permanence. Cnut capitalized on this, blending fear, strategy, and legitimacy. The kingdom operated differently than it had under Æthelred, yet stability gradually returned. Cnut carefully aligned with the church, reinforcing his legitimacy. Bishops and abbots promoted his rule as just and divinely sanctioned. Svein had not had time to engage with religious institutions. Cnut understood their power. By embedding himself in the spiritual hierarchy, Cnut reinforced both perception and obedience. The church became a pillar of long-term governance, legitimizing Danish rule while respecting English tradition. Nobles were the linchpins of Cnut's authority. Svein's brief reign had taught them the power of conditional loyalty. Cnut carefully integrated the most influential lords into his administration, granting privileges, offices, and autonomy while keeping ultimate authority centralized. Resistance was rare, carefully managed, and swiftly contained. England's aristocracy became partners rather than obstacles, a critical component of long-term stability. Cnut rebuilt England's economy, stabilizing trade and taxation. Svein's brief conquest had drained resources and shaken confidence. Cnut restored order, encouraged commerce, and ensured regular collection of taxes. He strengthened ports, secured roads, and fostered trade with Scandinavia and Europe. England was no longer merely surviving. It was thriving under integrated governance, blending local authority with effective central control. Cnut's rule combined English law with Scandinavian customs, creating a hybrid legal system. Svein had ruled briefly without lasting legal reform. Cnut enforced justice selectively, consolidating authority while maintaining legitimacy. Courts functioned consistently, disputes were resolved predictably, and nobles understood their obligations. England's society became stable because the perception of fair and enforceable laws reinforced loyalty, completing the lessons Svein's occupation had begun. Cnut maintained a disciplined military, not for conquest alone but as a guarantee of stability. Svein had demonstrated the psychological power of a fleet. Cnut used it to reinforce authority. Coastal garrisons monitored potential uprisings, while a professional corps ensured order. The military presence balanced fear and security, showing England that authority could be enforced but would also protect, not merely dominate. Cnut's reign also encouraged cultural integration. Scandinavian settlers merged with the English population, bringing new art, traditions, and governance practices. Svein's brief rule had introduced the idea of Danish influence. Cnut expanded it thoughtfully, ensuring the kingdom absorbed rather than resisted foreign elements. The blending of cultures created a lasting Anglo-Danish identity, visible in language, law, and local governance. By the 1020s, Cnut's authority was secure. Svein's brief conquest had provided a blueprint for opportunity. Cnut had transformed it into lasting rule. England's monarchy had been tested and reshaped. Nobles were loyal, laws were respected, and the church reinforced legitimacy. Svein's invisible influence persisted in every strategy, every alliance, and every decree. Despite its impact, Svein's reign faded from popular memory. Chroniclers focused on the long, stable rule of Cnut. Yet every policy, alliance, and psychological maneuver owed something to Svein's short occupation. History often overlooks brief reigns, but their consequences can echo for decades. Svein's example influenced kingship, governance, and strategy long after he disappeared from narrative prominence. England emerged fundamentally changed. Svein had destabilized it temporarily. Cnut had stabilized it permanently. Nobles understood conditional loyalty, citizens knew the fragility of power, and the monarchy had learned that authority required belief. England's political, social, and economic structures were stronger, more cautious, and more adaptable than ever. Svein's brief presence had catalyzed transformation that would endure for generations. Europe watched England's transformation closely. Svein had shown that Viking influence could extend to full kingship. Cnut demonstrated that long-term rule required strategy, diplomacy, and integration. England's shift influenced neighboring kingdoms' perceptions of authority, loyalty, and conquest. Svein's brief occupation had set the example. Cnut's consolidation confirmed its lessons. England became a model of hybrid governance, admired and studied across the continent. Cnut maintained stability through a balance of force, diplomacy, and legitimacy. Nobles retained partial autonomy but were closely monitored. Laws were enforced consistently, and trade flourished. Svein's brief disruption had taught England the dangers of unchecked authority. Cnut ensured that future kings would govern with balance, avoiding both excessive fear and neglect. The Anglo-Danish integration left a lasting cultural legacy. Language, law, and architecture reflected Scandinavian influence. Sinut's rule created a synthesis, blending Svein's Danish presence with English traditions. Trade networks expanded, artistic influences mingled, and governance became more structured. Svein's brief occupation may have been forgotten in chronicles, but its imprint on strategy, culture, and perception endured. Svein taught England critical lessons. Kingship is fragile, loyalty conditional, and perception paramount. Sinut applied these lessons effectively, securing long-term authority. Nobles understood negotiation, citizens understood consequences, and governance became more sophisticated. England's political landscape had been irrevocably altered in ways that would shape the next century. Svein's brief occupation exerted an invisible influence on English history. His reign lasted weeks, yet it changed expectations, strategy, and governance. Sinut's success was built on the awareness Svein had created, the understanding that authority could be challenged, that fear could be leveraged, and that legitimacy must be demonstrated. The lessons of 1014 extended far beyond the battlefield, into strategy, diplomacy, and cultural integration. By the mid-1020s, England was effectively united under Sinut. The lessons Svein imparted, though subtle, had facilitated acceptance of a new order. Nobles were loyal, laws enforced, and trade restored. The Anglo-Danish kingdom operated efficiently, blending traditions and stabilizing society. Svein's brief reign had catalyzed change. Sinut's consolidation made it permanent. England was no longer the same kingdom that Svein had briefly occupied in 1014. From a historical perspective, Svein Forkbeard's 5 weeks in England were transformative. Though short and largely forgotten, they reshaped perception, loyalty, and governance. Sinut's subsequent rule built upon these lessons, demonstrating the importance of strategy, patience, and legitimacy. England's monarchy, nobility, and citizens had all been subtly altered, creating conditions for stability and integration. History often overlooks fleeting reigns, yet their consequences can echo for centuries. Svein's invisible conquest is one of these rare, enduring moments. Svein Forkbeard may have ruled England for only 5 weeks, yet his impact was enduring. He revealed vulnerabilities, reshaped perceptions of power, and laid the groundwork for Sinut's long, stable reign. England was transformed politically, culturally, and psychologically. Nobles understood conditional loyalty, citizens understood the fragility of authority, and kings learned the importance of legitimacy and strategy. The brief, almost invisible conquest of 1014 became a catalyst for centuries of Anglo-Danish integration. History measures not only the duration of rule, but the depth of consequences. Svein's short presence changed the course of England, leaving a legacy far greater than the weeks he spent on its soil. History often remembers long-reigning kings, grand battles, and sweeping conquests. Yet sometimes, the most profound transformations emerge from brief, almost invisible moments. Svein Forkbeard's 5 weeks in England in 1014 were precisely that kind of moment. A king ruling for barely more than a month might seem insignificant at first glance, but on closer inspection, Svein reshaped perception, exposed systemic weaknesses, and set in motion events that would redefine a kingdom. His brief conquest revealed that authority is fragile, loyalty conditional, and perception often outweighs raw power. Æthelred's precarious restoration, the cautious maneuvering of nobles, and the vigilance of the English people all carried the imprint of those few weeks. Even in absence, Svein's influence endured. He became a catalyst whose lessons rippled across the kingdom and into the strategies of his son, Cnut. Cnut's eventual rise was not mere continuation of Danish ambition. It was a careful study in patience, strategy, and governance. Svein's temporary reign offered lessons in fear, perception, and timing. Cnut transformed these lessons into lasting rule, blending English tradition with Scandinavian authority to create an Anglo-Danish kingdom that endured for decades. Svein's story reminds us that history is not defined by the length of reigns or size of armies. Sometimes it is shaped by subtle shifts, by invisible forces of psychology, perception, and timing. In those 5 weeks, Svein changed England forever.